The fluorescent lights in the Champaign Carl Hart Center waiting room buzzed at exactly 3:47 p.m. on Wednesday, October 16th, 2024. Howard Brennan sat in the molded plastic chair with his calloused hands flat on his thighs, watching the second hand sweep around the wall clock. 64 years old, third-generation farmer. 2,800 acres of corn and soybeans split across Roberts Township in Iroquois County, Illinois. Former structural welding crew lead at Caterpillar Decatur from 1984 to 1996. 12 years retired from factory work due to an arrhythmia condition that still required quarterly monitoring. The waiting room smelled of industrial cleaner and old magazines. Three other people sat scattered across the rows of chairs. An elderly woman with a walker parked beside her. A middle-aged man scrolling through his phone. A young mother with a sleeping infant in a carrier. Nobody made eye contact. That was the protocol in medical waiting rooms. Everyone wrapped in their own anxiety, their own calculations about what the doctor might say. Howard had been coming to this cardiology practice for 12 years. Same building, same waiting room, different faces behind the reception desk, but the same ritual. Check in, sit down, wait. Try not to think about the fact that you're here because your heart doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Dr. Patricia Holbrook entered through the side door at 3:52 p.m., carrying the manila folder with Howard's name printed across the tab. She was 48 years old, originally from Chicago, relocated to Champaign 15 years ago to join this practice. Howard had been her patient for 8 of those years. She'd seen him through 2 medication adjustments, one moderate cardiac episode that had required hospitalization, and countless quarterly checkups that confirmed what both of them already knew. Howard Brennan's heart was slowly failing, and the only question was how fast. She sat across from him without preamble. Your EKG shows the same irregular pattern we flagged in July. Blood pressure is 148/94. That's higher than I want to see. She opened the folder. Howard, you're doing too much physical labor. The stress on your cardiovascular system is cumulative. One more significant exertion event, and we're looking at acute cardiac episode territory. Howard kept his hands flat on his thighs. The fabric of his work jeans was worn smooth from years of sitting in tractor cabs and truck seats. His fingernails were permanently stained from machinery grease and soil. The hands of a man who'd spent 64 years working with his body as the primary tool. What's significant exertion mean in practical terms? Lifting more than 40 pounds repeatedly. Operating heavy machinery for extended periods without rest. Physical work in high-stress situations. Welding, especially overhead welding, where you're supporting your own body weight in awkward positions. She closed the folder and looked at him directly. I'm recommending you limit farm operations to supervisory roles only. No equipment operation, no manual labor. Delegate the physical work. Doctor, I run a grain farm with one hired hand during planting and harvest. There's no such thing as supervisory only during October. Then you're choosing to risk a heart attack, Howard. I can't be more direct than that. She handed him 3 prescription refills and a follow-up appointment card for January. Howard took them both and stood. The conversation was over. He'd heard what she had to say. She'd documented her recommendations in his file. Now the responsibility shifted to him to either follow those recommendations or accept the consequences of ignoring them. He drove the silver 2018 Ford F250 North on Route 49 toward Roberts with Dr. Holbrook's words sitting in the cab beside him like an unwanted passenger. The October afternoon was clear and cool, temperature in the mid-50s. Perfect harvest weather. The fields on both sides of the highway showed the patchwork of completed harvest in standing corn. Some farmers were finished for the season. Others, like Howard, still had weeks of work ahead. The combine was still running in the back 40, 300 acres of corn still standing. The grain elevator would be open until 7 p.m. He needed to make at least 2 more truck runs before close of business. The corn was testing at 18% moisture, which was higher than ideal, but within acceptable range for elevator delivery. Another week of dry weather would bring it down to 16%, but the forecast showed rain coming Saturday. Better to take the slight dock on moisture now than risk weather damage later. His phone buzzed at 4:22 p.m. The caller ID showed Randall Tucker. Howard thumbed the answer button and put the call on speaker. Earl? Howard, turn on your radio, AM 1450, right now. The urgency in Earl's voice made Howard reach for the dial immediately. Earl Tucker didn't get excited about small things. If he was calling and telling Howard to turn on the radio right now, something significant had happened. Howard found the station. The voice of the WGFA announcer came through mid-sentence. Structural failure at approximately 4:14 p.m. this afternoon. The Iroquois County Cooperative Grain Elevator at Roberts has experienced a catastrophic collapse of the primary storage bin. Early reports indicate the west wall of the main concrete stave structure gave way under pressure from wet corn that had been loaded across the previous 72 hours. Two grain trucks were at the loadout during the collapse. Both drivers exited their vehicles safely. No injuries have been reported. OSHA inspectors are en route. The elevator has been closed indefinitely pending investigation. We'll bring you more information as it becomes available. Howard pulled the F-250 onto the gravel shoulder and put the transmission in park. He sat with both hands on the steering wheel while the announcer moved on to crop futures and soybean prices and national agricultural news that suddenly seemed completely irrelevant. The Roberts elevator was the primary loadout for 184 farms across Roberts, Buckley, and Onarga townships. The nearest alternative elevator was the Watsika facility 32 miles east. The Onarga elevator 24 miles south was already operating at capacity because they'd been taking overflow from smaller operations all season. The next closest option was Stern Equipment's grain desk in Champaign, 38 miles southwest, and Stern's operation had been running 3-hour wait times all week. Howard did the math in his head, the kind of math that farmers do automatically, constantly, the calculations that determine whether you make money or lose money in any given season. 300 acres at 180 bushels per acre meant 54,000 bushels still to harvest on his own ground. Market price today was $4.62 per bushel. That was $249,480 in gross revenue if the corn moved to market clean and dry. But wet corn sitting in a pile on the ground through a rain event meant spoilage. Spoilage meant dock at the elevator. A 10% dock on 54,000 bushels was 5,400 bushels yield lost. At $4.62 per bushel, that was $24,948 gone. And that calculation assumed only 10% loss. A heavy rain on uncovered corn could push losses to 20 or even 30%. And that calculation didn't account for the 183 other farms in the same situation. Didn't account for the economic impact on the co-op itself, or on the town of Roberts, or on the dozens of businesses that depended on harvest season revenue. A collapsed grain elevator wasn't just an infrastructure failure. It was an economic disaster that rippled out through an entire community. He called Earl back at 4:31 p.m. "Earl, you hear the details beyond the radio report." "I heard Cassidy Porter called the co-op board into emergency session. They're meeting at the office right now." Cassidy Porter, 45 years old, widow, 3 years running the Iroquois County Cooperative as general manager after her husband died of a heart attack in the elevator office in January 2022. Jack Porter had been 51 years old, dropped dead at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon with a full schedule of meetings still ahead of him. Cassidy had stepped into the role within 3 days of the funeral because the co-op board needed someone who knew the operation and could take charge immediately. Howard had known Cassidy since she was 16 years old, working summer counter shifts at the co-op selling seed and fertilizer to farmers who'd watched her grow up. She'd left Roberts for college at Illinois State, came back with a degree in agricultural business, married Jack Porter, who was running the co-op, and spent the next 22 years learning every aspect of grain handling operations. When Jack died, she knew the business better than most men who'd spent 30 years in the industry. "Earl, Cassidy's sharp. If there's a path forward, she'll find it. Howard, I'm guessing she's going to call you before the night's out." Howard ended the call and sat watching the sun drop toward the horizon through the truck windshield. The October light was golden and slanted, the kind of light that made everything look temporary, like the world was holding its breath between one season and the next. Margaret would be starting dinner prep in the kitchen by now. Claire and 7-year-old Dylan would be at the table working on homework. His daughter had moved back into the farmhouse 6 months ago after her divorce from Garrett Voss became final. The divorce settlement had not been generous. Garrett was a contractor with good lawyers and a vindictive streak, and he'd made sure Claire walked away with minimal assets and maximum ongoing obligations. Claire was working part-time at the Buckley Casey's general store, while she looked for something with health insurance and retirement benefits. 28 hours a week at $11 an hour, $308 a week before taxes, approximately $1,300 a month. Enough to cover her car payment and insurance and phone bill and groceries with maybe $100 left over. Not enough to rent her own place. Not enough to rebuild any kind of financial independence. Dylan was in second grade at Roberts Elementary. Good kid, smart, quiet, still processing the divorce and the move to his grandparents' house and the fact that his father only saw him every other weekend for supervised visits that felt more like inspections than family time. The medical bills from Howard's last cardiac monitoring appointment sat in the desk drawer in the farm office. $12,400. The payment plan with the hospital allowed $200 per month. He was current through October. The equipment loan from First National Bank of Onarga for the 2022 John Deere 8R 410 tractor carried a balance of $178,600 at 6.2% interest. Monthly payment was $3,400, also current. But all of that arithmetic assumed the corn moved to market within the normal harvest window. A month's delay in marketing meant elevator storage fees piling up at approximately 12 cents per bushel per month. 2 months meant potential contract penalties with the grain buyer who expected delivery by December 1st. 3 months meant margin erosion that could push the operation from profitable to marginal, from sustainable to drowning in interest payments and compounding costs. He put the truck back in drive and continued north toward Roberts. The highway was familiar. He'd driven this route 10,000 times over 64 years, knew every curve, every intersection, every farmhouse along the way, could identify which fields belonged to which families, which operations were thriving, and which were hanging on by increasingly thin margins. Margaret met him at the kitchen door at 5:48 p.m. She wore the faded denim apron over her work jeans and the blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. 59 years old, married to Howard for 37 years, registered nurse at Gibson Area Hospital in Champaign until she retired in 2019 to help full-time with farm operations. She'd spent 34 years in nursing, most of that time in the cardiac unit, which meant she understood exactly what Dr. Holbrook's warnings meant better than Howard did himself. Cassidy called the house line at 5:30, Margaret said. She's asking if you can come to the co-op office at 7 tonight. Howard washed his hands at the kitchen sink. The water ran brown with field dust and equipment grease. He scrubbed with the pumice soap until his hands looked mostly clean, though the permanent staining under his fingernails never came out completely. What did Cassidy say exactly? She said the structural engineer from the insurance company was on site at 4:45. The primary bin is a total loss. The rail loadout structure is intact. Only the storage bin failed. She said if somebody could build a temporary access ramp into the existing rail loadout trucks, could dump directly into rail cars. Margaret dried a plate and set it in the rack. She said you'd know what that means. Howard dried his hands on the dish towel. Claire sat at the kitchen table with Dylan beside her, working through a math worksheet. 7 years old, second grade. Brown hair cut short because that was easier for Claire to manage in the mornings before school. He wore the Roberts Elementary t-shirt and blue jeans with grass stains on both knees from recess. Grandpa did the grain place break. Howard hung the towel on the rack and walked to the table. Part of it broke Dylan. They're going to fix it. Can you fix it, Grandpa? The question was simple. The answer was not. Could Howard fix it? In the technical sense, yes. He had the engineering knowledge and the structural welding experience and the project management skills to design and supervise the construction of a temporary drive-over ramp that would allow trucks to bypass the collapsed bin and dump directly into the rail loadout system. But fixing it would require physical labor that Dr. Holbrook had just explicitly told him to avoid. Fixing it would require 3 or 4 days of intensive work that could trigger the cardiac episode she'd warned about. Fixing it would mean choosing between following medical advice that could extend his life and taking action that could save the financial stability of 184 farms, including his own. Claire put her hand on Dylan's shoulder. Finish your worksheet, sweetheart. Howard looked at Margaret across the kitchen. She was watching him with the expression that said she already knew what he was thinking and was trying to decide whether to argue about it now or wait until they were alone. I need to hear what Cassidy's thinking before I commit to anything, Howard said. The doctor said no physical labor. You heard that same conversation I did this afternoon. I heard it, Howard. I also heard the radio report about the elevator. And I know what happens to this county if 184 farms can't move grain for the next month. The unspoken calculation hung between them. Howard's health versus the community's economic survival. His individual well-being versus collective need. The kind of choice that shouldn't exist but did exist constantly in rural America, where infrastructure was fragile and expertise was concentrated in aging individuals who couldn't easily be replaced. At 6:55 p.m., Howard drove the F-250 into the gravel lot at the Iroquois County Cooperative Office in Roberts. The October sun had set 20 minutes earlier. The security lights mounted on the elevator structure cast harsh white illumination across the wreckage. The scene looked worse in person than Howard had imagined from the radio description. The west wall of the main concrete stave bin leaned at a pronounced angle against the rail spur loadout building. The concrete stave construction method used interlocking concrete panels held together with steel bands under tension. When the wet corn had exceeded the design load capacity, one of those steel bands had failed. The failure propagated rapidly through the structure, and within seconds the entire west wall had given way under the hydraulic pressure of 184,000 bushels of 18% moisture corn. A massive pile of wet yellow corn spread across 320 feet of gravel between the collapsed bin and the railroad tracks. The corn pile stood 8 feet tall at its peak and tapered down to the edge where it met the gravel. The two grain trucks that had been at the loadout during the collapse sat at odd angles, partially buried in corn, their dump beds still raised. Both trucks were Peterbilt 389s, probably 40 years old, combined worth maybe $60,000 each if you could find buyers. Now they were buried in corn and would need significant work to get operational again. The visual impact was stunning. 184,000 bushels of corn spread across the ground like a yellow lake. At $4.62 per bushel, that was approximately $850,000 worth of grain lying exposed to weather and spoilage and vermin. The co-op's insurance would cover some of that loss, but not all. There would be deductibles and exclusions and arguments about whether the collapse was due to design failure or operational error or inadequate maintenance. Cassidy Porter stood in the gravel lot beside her white 2021 Toyota Tacoma pickup, talking with a man in a navy polo shirt and khaki pants. The man carried a leather portfolio under one arm and had the posture of someone who spent his days conducting inspections and writing reports. As Howard approached, Cassidy turned and raised one hand in greeting. "Howard, thanks for coming. This is Norris Fletcher, Illinois Department of Agriculture Bureau of Markets." Norris Fletcher extended his hand, 50 years old approximately, thinning hair combed straight back, reading glasses hanging from a lanyard around his neck. The kind of methodical, detail-oriented person who ended up in regulatory inspection roles. "Mr. Brennan, Cassidy's been explaining your background." Howard shook his hand. Norris had a firm grip, but not an aggressive one. The handshake of someone who was confident in his authority, but didn't need to prove it through physical dominance. "What's the state's assessment?" Norris gestured toward the collapsed bin. The structural engineer from the co-op's insurance carrier completed the initial inspection at 6:15. "The bin is condemned. Demolition will take approximately 3 weeks once we clear the regulatory protocols. Replacement construction will take 6 to 8 months, assuming normal procurement and construction timelines. The rail loadout structure itself is sound. The bin failure was isolated to the concrete stave assembly. The conveyor system that feeds from ground level up to the rail car loading chute is still operational." Howard looked at the rail loadout structure. It was a separate building, steel frame construction, that housed the conveyor belt and loading mechanism that transferred grain from the storage bin into railroad hopper cars positioned on the siding. The structure stood intact, undamaged, except for some cosmetic corn debris. The conveyor system that normally carried grain from the main bin to the loading chute emerged from the collapsed structure at ground level, approximately 80 feet from the railroad tracks. "The conveyor still works?" Howard asked. "We tested it 30 minutes ago," Cassidy said. "Full operational capacity. The feed point is accessible. If we had a way to get grain from truck height down to ground level at that feed point, we could bypass the destroyed bin entirely." Howard walked closer to the collapsed bin and the rail loadout structure. Norris and Cassidy followed. He stopped at the point where a temporary ramp would begin its rise toward the elevated loading position. The ground was compacted gravel with minimal standing water, despite the recent rains. The base material was solid. The footing would be adequate for a loaded grain truck if the ramp structure distributed the weight properly across a sufficient foundation. "What's the clearance height at the loading chute?" Howard asked. 14 feet from grade to the dump point, Cassidy said. "We need trucks to drive up to that height and dump into a collection pit that feeds the existing conveyor. The ramp would need to rise from ground level to 14 feet across a horizontal run of approximately 84 feet. That's a 12% grade." Howard did the engineering in his head. A 12% grade was at the upper limit of what a loaded semi-truck could safely navigate, but it was within acceptable parameters for emergency access. The critical factors would be the structural integrity of the ramp deck and the approach angle where the truck transitioned from flat ground onto the inclined ramp. Too steep an approach angle, and trucks would high center on their chassis. Too shallow an approach, and the overall ramp length would extend beyond the available footprint. Ramp width needs to be 24 feet to handle standard grain trucks with adequate margin. The dump platform at the top needs to support 80,000 pounds gross vehicle weight. That's a fully loaded B-train configuration. Howard turned to face Cassidy. The gravity pit under the dump platform would need to be 4 feet deep to feed the existing conveyor at the correct angle. You're looking at approximately 12 tons of structural steel in I-beams for the load-bearing skeleton. Oak decking across the full width, welded joints at every primary connection point. Norris Fletcher had pulled a small notepad from his portfolio and was writing in precise, compact handwriting. "What's the construction timeline for a structure like that?" A licensed contractor would quote 6 to 8 weeks under normal permitting and inspection protocols. Maybe compress that to 4 weeks under emergency authorization if they pulled crews from other jobs. And under emergency protocols with volunteer labor. Howard looked at Cassidy, then at Norris. The question was whether to be honest about what was actually possible or to give a conservative estimate that built in margin for unexpected problems. He chose honesty. 3 days if the materials are on site by Friday morning and we have the crew to do it. Norris Fletcher stopped writing. He looked up from his notepad and studied Howard's face like he was trying to determine whether Howard was serious or delusional. 3 days to build an 84-foot drive-over ramp rated for 80,000-pound vehicles. 3 days with the right crew and the right equipment. I'm not saying it would be easy. I'm saying it's possible. "What crew do you have in mind?" Cassidy answered before Howard could speak. "He's talking about the Cross Brand Club." The Cross Brand Club, formed in 2013 after the Iroquois County flood event when 32 farms lost equipment and structures to rising water. The Iroquois River had overflowed its banks during a spring storm that dropped 6 inches of rain in 8 hours. The flooding had destroyed machine sheds and grain bins and equipment worth millions of dollars. In the aftermath, 7 men had recognized that pooling resources and skills could solve problems that were impossible for individual operators working alone. Randall Earl Tucker on John Deere equipment, Calvin Merrick on Bobcat skid steers and Genie telehandlers, Landon Whitmore on Lull rough terrain forklifts, Nash Aldridge with timber resources and forestry expertise, Foster Bryant on welding and metal fabrication, Vincent Shaw with steel supplier connections and structural material sourcing, Miles Hartley on grain handling equipment and conveyor systems, and Howard Brennan on structural engineering and welding supervision. 7 men, 7 specializations, 7 different equipment brands, which is where the club name came from. They'd helped each other through emergencies for 11 years, barn fires and equipment failures and harvest disasters. They'd rebuilt Nash's machine shed after a tornado in 2015. They'd constructed temporary grain storage for Calvin when his bins collapsed under snow load in 2018. They'd installed emergency irrigation pumps for 3 farms during the drought of 2020. But they'd never taken on anything this large or this visible or this critical to the entire county's economic survival. "Earl coordinates the club," Howard said. "I'd need to call him tonight. He'd need to make 6 calls to the other members. Everyone would need to commit their equipment and their time before we could move forward." Norris Fletcher looked at Cassidy. "The state can issue an emergency permit for a temporary loadout structure under CFR 1910.272 grain handling provisions. The structure would need to meet the same load ratings and safety specifications as a permanent installation, but the permitting timeline compresses from 8 weeks to same-day issuance. The inspection and certification process would still be required before the structure could be used for commercial loading operations. Cassidy nodded. If Howard and the Cross Brand Club can build it in 3 days, the state can permit and inspect it in that same window. If the structure passes inspection, yes. But I want to be clear about what that means. The inspection standards don't change. The safety requirements don't change. The only thing that changes is the timeline. If the structure doesn't meet specs, it doesn't get certified. And if it doesn't get certified, you've spent 3 days and whatever money this costs on something you can't use. Howard looked at the collapsed bin and the rail loadout structure and the massive pile of wet corn spread across the gravel. He thought about Dr. Holbrook's words from 4 hours earlier. No physical labor, no welding, supervisory roles only. He thought about the $12,400 in medical bills and the $178,600 in equipment debt and the $249,480 in corn revenue that would evaporate if the grain didn't move to market dry. He thought about Claire working part-time at the Casey's General Store for $1,300 a month. He thought about Dylan doing homework at the kitchen table. He thought about Margaret standing at the sink, drying dishes, watching her husband make calculations about risk and responsibility, and whether the needs of the community outweighed the medical advice of his cardiologist. "I need to talk to Earl," Howard said, "and I need to talk to Margaret." He called Earl Tucker from the F2 Fabieso at 8:17 p.m. The cab was dark and cold. Howard had the engine running for heat, but hadn't turned on the interior lights. The dashboard glow illuminated his hands on the steering wheel. Earl answered on the second ring. "Earl Cassidy Porter needs the Cross Brand Club at full strength starting Friday morning." "What's the job?" Howard walked Earl through the conversation with Cassidy and Norris Fletcher. The temporary drive-over ramp, the structural specifications, the 3-day construction window before Saturday's rain, the materials list that would require steel I-beams and oak timber and welding equipment and heavy machinery, the 6-man crew requirement plus Howard as engineer of record. The silence on the other end of the call lasted long enough that Howard started to wonder if the connection had dropped. Then Earl spoke. "Howard, that's the club at full strength. Calvin brings the Bobcat T870 and the Genie GTH1056 telehandler. Landon brings the Lull 644E rough terrain forklift. Nash brings oak timber off his back lot. Foster brings the welding rig and generator. Vincent brings steel I-beams from his fabrication contacts. Miles brings the portable PTO conveyor. That's 6 men plus you doing structural welding supervision." "That's the crew," Howard said. "Howard, you had a cardiology appointment today. What did Dr. Holbrook say?" The question wasn't casual. Earl knew about Howard's heart condition. Everyone in the Cross Brand Club knew. They'd modified how they worked together over the past few years to accommodate Howard's limitations. Less heavy lifting, more supervisory roles, making sure Howard had time to rest between intense work periods. Howard sat in the driver's seat with the phone against his ear and the engine running in the October night settling across the empty elevator parking lot. "She said no physical labor. She said delegating only. And you're proposing to supervise a 3-day emergency build of a structural welding project that'll have you on your feet for 40 hours straight. Earl, I'm proposing to keep 184 farms in Iroquois County from losing their harvest to weather and storage penalties." Earl was quiet again. Howard could hear Ruth's voice in the background, asking who was on the phone. Earl said something Howard couldn't make out. Then Earl came back on the line. "Ruth's going to ask me the same question Margaret's going to ask you. What do we tell them?" "We tell them this is what the Cross Brand Club exists for, and we tell them we'll be smart about how we do it. I'm not planning to do the physical welding work. Foster can handle that. I'll supervise. I'll check measurements and verify angles and certify the structural connections. But I won't be the one running the welding rig. Howard, I've known you for 34 years. When you get into a project, you don't stand back and supervise. You get in the middle of it. Then this time I'll work against my nature, because I promised Margaret I'd follow medical advice, and because I need to be alive at the end of this to see Dylan grow up." Earl was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, Howard, I'll make the 6 calls before I go to bed tonight. Everyone will be at the Roberts loadout by 7 a.m. Friday with materials in tow. But you need to clear this with Margaret first. That's not negotiable. If Margaret says no, the club doesn't take the job. Understood. And Howard, if your chest gets tight, if you feel off, if anything doesn't feel right, you stop immediately. You don't push through it. You stop and you tell someone. Agreed? Agreed. Howard ended the call and sat in the truck cab watching the security lights illuminate the wreckage of the collapsed grain bin. At 8:45 p.m., he drove home. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table when he came through the door. Claire and Dylan had gone upstairs. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator compressor cycling on in the corner and the old farmhouse settling in the cooling night air. Cassidy wants the Cross Brand Club to build a temporary ramp, Howard said. 3 days, Friday through Sunday. I'd be supervising the structural welding. Earl's making the calls tonight. Margaret kept both hands flat on the table. She'd changed out of her work clothes into sweatpants and a flannel shirt. Her reading glasses sat beside a crossword puzzle she'd been working on. The kitchen light cast shadows across her face that made her look older than 59. What did Dr. Holbrook say this afternoon? She said no physical labor. And supervising a welding crew for 3 days is physical labor, Howard. He sat down across from her. The kitchen table was oak built by Margaret's grandfather in 1947. Solid construction, the kind of furniture that lasted generations. Howard and Margaret had eaten breakfast at this table every morning for 37 years. They'd raised Claire at this table. Now they were raising Dylan at this table. The table had witnessed thousands of conversations about farm operations and family finances and medical concerns and community obligations. Margaret, if that elevator stays closed for a month, half the farms in this county are going to take losses they can't absorb. Some of them won't survive it. The younger operations with heavy debt loads will default on equipment loans. The older operations will burn through retirement savings trying to cover operating expenses while their grain sits in storage accruing fees. Cassidy Porter has a path forward if we can build this thing before Saturday's rain. And if you have a cardiac episode on day 2 of the build, what happens then? Then Earl takes over as lead engineer. He has my notes. He's been farming for 44 years and he's supervised construction projects before. The club would finish the job. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She picked up her reading glasses and cleaned them on her flannel shirt, a habit she had when she was thinking through something difficult. What happens to Claire and Dylan if you're not here anymore? The question was direct. Margaret had spent 34 years as a cardiac nurse. She'd seen hundreds of people die from heart attacks. She knew exactly what an acute cardiac episode looked like and how little time there was to intervene once symptoms began. She knew that Howard's condition put him in a high-risk category and that any significant exertion could be the trigger that pushed his damaged heart past the point of recovery. Claire and Dylan are why I'm doing this, Howard said. That corn sitting in our bins represents their financial security just as much as it represents ours. If I don't help build this ramp, I'm choosing to let that security wash away in Saturday's rain. And then, what we lose income. We fall behind on equipment payments. The bank starts making calls about restructuring debt. We end up in the same situation as half the farms in this county, hanging on by our fingernails and hoping we can make it to next season. Margaret looked at him across the table. 37 years of marriage. She knew every line in his face and every calculation he was running in his head and every reason he had for making the choice he was making. She also knew that arguing about it wouldn't change his mind. Howard Brennan didn't make decisions impulsively. He thought through all the angles, weighed all the factors, and then committed fully to whatever course of action he chose. You do the supervising, Howard. You don't do the welding. You stand back and you point and you tell other men where to put the joints. That's the only way I'm agreeing to this. That's the plan. And if your chest gets tight or your vision gets blurry or anything feels wrong, you stop immediately. You don't push through it. You stop. I'll stop. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were cool and dry. The line gets held by the people who show up. But the people who show up need to come home when it's finished. The alarm clock read 5:14 a.m. Thursday morning, October 17th. Howard stood at the kitchen window, watching headlights line up on Route 49. Every grain truck in 3 counties trying to find a place to dump corn before the forecasted rain hit Saturday afternoon. The line of trucks stretched north toward Watseka and south toward Onarga, red taillights and white headlights creating ribbons of light in the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret handed him a fresh cup of black coffee. Earl called at 5 a.m., all 6 men confirmed. They'll be at the Roberts loadout by 7 this morning with equipment and materials. Howard sipped the coffee. It was hot and strong the way he liked it. Margaret made coffee the old-fashioned way in a percolator on the stove because she said it tasted better than the automatic drip machines everyone used now. Howard agreed. What about the emergency fund? Earl said the fund has $18,000. You estimated $24,820 for materials. That's a $6,820 shortfall. Howard was quiet for a moment running the numbers. The Cross Brand Club maintained an emergency fund specifically for situations like this. The fund was built from small contributions over the years, $500 per member annually, plus occasional larger deposits when the club did paid work for non-members. The fund existed to cover materials costs for emergency projects where the labor was donated but supplies still had to be purchased. Steel I-beams were the biggest expense at $14,800. The oak timber from Nash's lot was $4,200. Welding consumables like electrodes and wire and shielding gas added another $2,400. Conveyor parts from Miles would run about $1,800. Equipment fuel across 3 days of heavy operation would be $980. And food service from the Roberts VFD Auxiliary Kitchen would be approximately $640. We'll figure it out when everyone gets there, Howard said. Someone will cover the gap. The club's never walked away from a job because of money. At 6:47 a.m., Howard arrived at the Roberts loadout. The October morning was clear and cold, temperature in the low 40s. The kind of morning where you could see your breath and feel the promise of winter in the air. The collapsed grain bin looked worse in morning light. The structural damage was more extensive than the evening shadows had revealed. The west wall hadn't just collapsed. It had essentially disintegrated, the concrete staves breaking apart under the lateral pressure of the wet corn. The pile of spilled corn had absorbed overnight moisture and was already showing signs of heat buildup. Howard could see steam rising from several points in the pile where internal temperatures were climbing. If that corn sat for another week in warm October weather, spoilage would claim at least 20% of the volume, possibly more. Calvin Merrick arrived first in the green 2020 Chevy Silverado, 3,500, pulling a 30-foot flatbed trailer, carrying the Bobcat T870 skid steer and the Genie GTH1056 telehandler. Calvin was 52 years old with a weathered face and hands that showed the scars of decades of equipment operation. He'd been farming since he was 16, took over his family's operation when his father died. In 1998, spent the next 10 years building the farm into a profitable mid-size operation, and then watched it all nearly collapse when his drinking got out of control. The drinking had started slowly, a beer after dinner, 2 beers, 3, then whiskey on the weekends, then whiskey during the week, then drinking during the day while operating equipment. By 2018, Calvin was going through a fifth of Jim Beam every 2 days. His wife left him. His daughter stopped calling. The bank sent letters about missed equipment payments. He was 6 months away from foreclosure when Earl Tucker showed up at his door at 7 in the morning and told him he was driving Calvin to a rehab facility in Springfield, whether Calvin wanted to go or not. Calvin had been sober for 3 years now. 3 years and 4 months, 1,211 days. He could tell you exactly how many days because he counted them every morning when he woke up. The sobriety had saved his farm and partially repaired his relationship with his daughter, though his ex-wife had remarried and moved to Indiana and wouldn't speak to him anymore. Calvin climbed down from the cab wearing the brown Carhartt jacket and the faded John Deere cap. His face was lean and weathered with deep lines around his eyes from 30 years of squinting into harvest dust. He walked over to where Howard stood beside the foundation footprint. Howard, hell of a mess. That's one way to describe it. Earl called me at 10:30 last night, said you need the Bobcat and the Genie for 3 days straight, said we're building a ramp in 72 hours or the county's corn doesn't move. That's about the size of it. Calvin looked at the collapsed bin in the staging area where the ramp would be built. What's my role? You're on the Bobcat for excavation and site prep. Then you transition to the Genie for I-beam placement. I need precision work, Calvin. 1/4-inch tolerances on every lift. You'll get it. Landon Whitmore pulled in second, driving the white 2019 Ford F3 50, towing the Lull 644E rough terrain forklift on a lowboy trailer. Landon was 58 years old with the posture and bearing of a career military man, which he had been until 2009. Marine Corps combat engineer, 2 tours in Iraq, multiple deployments to places he still didn't talk about even 15 years later. The PTSD from his military service manifested in hypervigilance and occasional episodes triggered by sudden loud noises. He'd learned to manage it through routine and structure and medication that he took every morning without fail. He didn't drink, he didn't use recreational drugs. He went to bed at the same time every night and woke up at the same time every morning. The structure kept him functional. The alternative was the kind of chaos he'd seen consume other veterans who came home and couldn't find their footing in civilian life. Landon wore the olive drab field jacket with the USMC globe and anchor patch still sewn on the shoulder. He climbed down from the F350 and walked toward Howard with the same purposeful stride he'd used for 30 years in the Corps. Everything about Landon was precise. The way he walked, the way he spoke, the way he operated equipment. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary conversation, no tolerance for imprecision. Howard, Earl said you need the lull for heavy lifting. E-beam placement. Each beam weighs between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds. I need them positioned within a quarter-inch of the placement marks. Can you do that? I can do that. Nash Aldridge arrived third in the silver, 2018 GMC Sierra 2500, pulling a gooseneck trailer stacked with rough-sawn oak timbers. Nash was 61 years old, fourth-generation timber farmer, whose family had maintained 80 acres of managed oak forests south of Roberts since 1947. The timber operation had been profitable for decades, providing a steady secondary income that supplemented the primary corn and soybean farming operation. Nash and Howard had a history that went back 16 months to a boundary dispute over 5 acres that bordered both properties. The disputed land had been part of the original Aldridge property dating back to Nash's great-grandfather, but a county survey in 1962 had placed the boundary line in a position that was later determined to be inaccurate. In 2023, Howard had commissioned a professional survey using GPS and modern measurement techniques. The survey showed that the actual property line was approximately 300 feet east of where Nash had believed it to be for his entire life. The surveyor's report had settled the question definitively. The 5 acres belonged to Howard's property, not Nash's. But those 5 acres included approximately 12 acres of mature oak timber that Nash had been planning to harvest. The loss of that timber represented roughly $48,000 in harvest revenue that Nash had been counting on to pay for his son's college tuition at Illinois State University. Nash had fought the survey results, hired his own surveyor, got the same answer, consulted a lawyer about challenging the boundaries. The lawyer told him he had no case. The survey was accurate. The land was Howard's. Nash could accept it, or he could spend tens of thousands of dollars on a legal challenge he would inevitably lose. Nash's son had withdrawn from Illinois State University after his freshman year because the family couldn't cover tuition without the timber revenue. The boy had come home and taken a job at a farm equipment dealership in Watseka. Nash blamed Howard for that, blamed him for being technically right about property boundaries while being morally wrong about the human cost of enforcing those boundaries. Nash and Howard hadn't spoken directly to each other since the surveyor's report was filed in June 2023. They'd been in the same room at cross-brand club meetings, but Nash directed his comments to Earl or to the group at large, never directly to Howard. The relationship had been frozen in place, neither men willing to take the first step toward reconciliation. Now Nash was climbing out of his truck with a trailer full of oak timber that would be used to build a ramp on Howard's engineering plans under Howard's supervision. Earl must have made a hell of a convincing argument on that phone call last night. Nash walked toward the foundation area without making eye contact with Howard. He spoke to the air somewhere between them. Earl said you need 4-inch oak decking boards. I've got 1,200 linear feet of rough-sawn oak on the trailer. That should be enough for the ramp surface and the platform. That's about right, Howard said. Thank you for bringing it. Nash nodded once and walked back to his truck to start unloading. The conversation was over. No reconciliation, no acknowledgement of the past 16 months, just 2 men working toward a common goal while maintaining personal distance. Foster Bryant pulled in fourth, driving the red 2017 Ram 3500, towing a trailer with a Miller Trailblazer 325 welding rig and a portable generator. Foster was 63 years old with the thick forearms and scarred hands of a man who'd spent 41 years doing metal fabrication. He'd started welding in vocational school in 1980, got his first certification at 19, worked his way through structural welding and pipeline welding and underwater welding before settling into agricultural fabrication work in the 1990s. Foster had a reputation for quality work. His welds were clean, his measurements were precise, and his finished products lasted. But he also had a reputation for a temper that had led to multiple confrontations over the years. He was the kind of man who took criticism of his work as a personal insult and responded accordingly. The worst incident had been 3 years ago at a farm equipment auction where Foster and Calvin had gotten into an argument about the quality of a used grain auger. Calvin had suggested the auger's mounting brackets showed signs of stress, cracking from poor welding. Foster had taken this as a direct attack on his professional competency. The argument escalated to shoving. The shoving escalated to a full fight that required 3 other men to break up. Calvin ended up with a split lip. Foster ended up with bruised ribs and a formal warning from the auction house that he was banned from attending future sales. The 2 men had maintained a cold distance since then. They were both members of the Cross Brand Club, but they avoided working together on projects. Earl managed the assignments to keep them separated. If Foster was on a job, Calvin usually wasn't, and vice versa. Now they were going to spend 3 days working side by side on a high-stress project where mistakes could have serious consequences. Foster climbed down from the Ram and walked toward Howard. Earl said, "You need welding work, primary structural joints and secondary attachments." "That's right, but I need to be clear about the division of responsibility. I'm the engineer of record on this project. Every primary load-bearing weld gets my personal inspection and sign-off. You'll handle the execution, but I verify the quality before we move to the next phase." Foster's jaw tightened. "I've been welding professionally for 41 years. I don't need someone standing over my shoulder checking my work." "This isn't about your competency, Foster. It's about liability and regulatory requirements. The state inspector needs to see documentation that the engineer of record personally certified every critical connection. That's me. You're doing the physical work because Dr. Holbrook told me yesterday that I can't do sustained welding anymore. But the certification is my responsibility." Foster looked at Howard for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "All right, you check my work. I can live with that as long as it's documented that I'm doing quality welding and you're just verifying for regulatory compliance." That's exactly how it'll be documented. Vincent Shaw arrived 5th in the dark blue 2021 Ford Vaum 250, pulling a trailer loaded with 24-inch steel I-beams. Vincent was 57 years old with gray hair and the methodical movements of someone who'd spent decades handling heavy materials. He'd owned and operated a welding and fabrication business in Champaign for 34 years before selling it in 2022. The sale had been described as retirement, but the truth was more complicated. Vincent had been diagnosed with stage 3 prostate cancer in June 2024, 4 months ago. The initial diagnosis had come from a routine PSA blood test that showed elevated levels. The follow-up biopsy confirmed the cancer. The staging scans showed it was contained to the prostate, but at an advanced stage within that organ. The oncologist recommended immediate treatment, hormone therapy to shrink the tumor, followed by radiation therapy to destroy any remaining cancer cells. Vincent had told his wife Elena about the diagnosis. They'd spent 2 weeks researching treatment options and survival statistics and making plans for how to handle the next 6 months. But Vincent hadn't told anyone else, not his adult children, not his friends, not the other members of the Cross Brand Club. He'd decided to keep the cancer private until the treatment was finished and he knew the outcome. The hormone therapy had started in July. The side effects included fatigue, hot flashes, and chronic pain in his joints and muscles. Vincent managed it with over-the-counter pain medication and by modifying his activity level. He moved slower than he used to. He took more breaks. He paced himself. But he stayed functional and he kept the cancer secret. Now he was standing in the Roberts Elevator parking lot at 7 in the morning, having spent the previous day coordinating with steel suppliers to source 12 24-inch I-beams, on emergency notice. The beams were on his trailer. Each beam was 24 feet long and weighed approximately 1,800 pounds. Total weight in approximately 22,000 pounds. Vincent had spent Wednesday afternoon loading those beams onto his trailer with a rented crane and his own stubborn determination not to let cancer slow him down. He climbed down from the F250 wearing the gray canvas work jacket that hid how much weight he'd lost over the past 4 months. He walked toward Howard with careful deliberation, each step measured and controlled to minimize the pain in his lower back and hips. Howard, I've got your steel. 12 I-beams, 24-inch profile grade 50 steel, sourced from Peterson Steel in Bloomington at cost plus 5%. Total $14,800. That's good work, Vincent. Thank you for coordinating that on short notice. Peterson's a client from my fabrication business days. They fast-tracked the order as a favor, delivered the beams to my shop yesterday afternoon. I loaded them last night. Howard looked at the trailer stacked with massive steel beams. You loaded 22,000 pounds of steel by yourself last night. I had a crane rental. It wasn't that difficult. It was that difficult, and both men knew it. Loading 12 1,800-pound I-beams onto a trailer was heavy physical work, even with mechanical assistance. Vincent had done it anyway because the project needed the steel, and there was no one else available to coordinate the sourcing and delivery. Miles Hartley arrived last in the white 2019 Chevy Silverado 2500, towing a trailer with an 18-inch portable PTO conveyor system. Miles was 59 years old with wire-rimmed glasses and the precise speaking style of an engineer. He'd worked as an elevator manager for 12 years before returning to full-time farming in 2016. His expertise was in grain handling, systems conveyor angles and flow rates, and the mechanical requirements for moving grain efficiently from one point to another. The portable PTO conveyor on his trailer was a system he'd built himself using commercial components and custom modifications. The conveyor belt was 18 inches wide and 40 feet long. It could be powered by a tractor's power takeoff shaft, which is what PTO stood for. The system could move approximately 6,000 bushels per hour at optimal configuration, which was more than adequate for the temporary ramp application. Miles climbed down from the Silverado and walked toward Howard with a rolled set of drawings under his arm. Howard, I've got the conveyor system and I've got installation drawings for the gravity pit feed angle. We need to talk about the engineering before we start excavation. Show me what you've got. Miles unrolled the drawings on the hood of Vincent's truck. The drawings showed detailed plans for the gravity pit configuration and the conveyor feed angle. Miles had done professional-grade SHIAD work with precise measurements and multiple views. The gravity pit needs to be 4 feet deep as you specified, but the critical factor is the feed angle where the pit bottom connects to the conveyor intake. We need exactly 28 degrees from horizontal, 26 degrees and the grain won't flow smoothly, 30 degrees and we get too much velocity and potential damage to the conveyor belt. Howard studied the drawings. How do we achieve 28 degrees in the field? I've built an angle template that mounts to the pit bottom during excavation. We dig to rough depth, install the template, verify the angle with a digital level, then pour a concrete pad at that exact angle. The concrete cures overnight. By Saturday morning, we've got a permanent feed surface at the correct geometry. That's solid engineering, Miles. Let's plan to pour the concrete Friday afternoon so it has maximum cure time before we start running grain on Saturday. Randall Earl Tucker pulled into the lot at 6:53 a.m. in the dark green 2020 John Deere Gator utility vehicle. Earl was 66 years old with steel blue eyes and the weathered face of a man who'd spent 6 decades working outdoors. He'd founded the Cross Brand Club in 2013 after the Iroquois County flood, but the real motivation for creating the club had come from a much more personal loss. Earl's son Marcus had died in a farm equipment accident in 2016. Marcus had been 28 years old, married for 3 years, talking about starting a family. He'd been repositioning a grain auger from one bin to another when the auger made contact with overhead power lines. The electrical shock had killed him instantly. Earl had been the one who found him 2 hours later when Marcus didn't come home for dinner. The loss had nearly destroyed Earl. He'd spent the 6 months after Marcus's death barely functioning, going through the motions of farm operations while Ruth handled everything else. He'd seriously considered selling the farm and moving away because every building and every piece of equipment reminded him of Marcus. The Cross-Brand Club had become Earl's way of processing that grief, a way of honoring what Marcus had believed about farming and community and the responsibility of those with skills and resources to help those in need. Marcus had always said farming was about more than putting seed in the ground and harvesting it in the fall. It was about being part of something bigger than yourself, about using your expertise to strengthen the community around you. Earl wore the tan Carhartt chore coat over a buffalo plaid flannel shirt and dark blue Wrangler jeans. He climbed out of the gator and walked toward where the 7 men were gathering near the foundation footprint. His presence changed the dynamic in the group. When Earl arrived, everyone paid attention. "Gentlemen," Earl said, "Howard's going to run through the construction plan. Then we'll talk about the emergency funds situation. Then we start work." Cassidy Porter arrived at 6:58 a.m. in her white Toyota Tacoma. She climbed out carrying a clipboard and a thermos of coffee. The 7 men gathered in a loose circle near the foundation footprint Howard had marked with wooden stakes the previous evening. The morning air was cold enough that everyone's breath was visible. The sun was just clearing the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Howard cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. The situation is what Earl described last night. The bin collapsed Wednesday afternoon. We have until Saturday evening to build a temporary drive-over ramp that allows trucks to dump directly into the existing rail loadout system. The ramp needs to be 24 feet wide, 84 feet long, rising 14 feet on a 12% grade. The structure needs to support 80,000-pound gross vehicle weight. The state inspector arrives this morning to issue the emergency permit. He'll return at 5 p.m. Friday for final inspection. If the structure passes, we start loading trucks Friday evening. If it fails, we make corrections overnight and re-inspect Saturday morning before the rain arrives." Nash Aldridge spoke without looking at Howard. His voice was directed at the group generally, not at Howard specifically. "Who's the engineer of record on this project?" "I am," Howard said. "I designed the structure last night. I hold an Illinois Class B structural engineering credential through my work at Caterpillar. The credential is current through January 2026. The state recognizes it for this type of emergency construction. And if something goes wrong during construction, if the structure fails, if someone gets injured, who carries the liability?" The Cross-Brand Club Emergency Fund carries general liability insurance through Indiana Farm Bureau. The policy covers emergency construction projects up to $200,000 in damages or injury claims. Cassidy's co-op insurance covers the rail loadout structure and the property. Every man here is covered under one policy or the other. Nash was quiet for a moment. "What's my role in the construction?" "You supervise the oak timber decking. 4-inch boards on 18-inch centers across the lower section today. Upper deck and dump platform tomorrow morning. Your 2 hired hands can assist with the installation. I need precision spacing and secure fastening on every board." "Understood." Foster Bryant stepped forward. "Who's doing primary structural welding?" "I am," Howard said, "but I need to clarify what that means. As engineer of record, I'm required to personally certify every critical weld. Foster, you're going to execute the welds under my supervision. I'll be marking the connection points, verifying the preparation, and inspecting the finished welds. Every primary load-bearing joint needs my personal sign-off before we proceed to the next phase." Foster looked at Howard steadily. The tension from their earlier conversation was still present, but controlled. "I've been welding professionally for 41 years. I can handle primary load-bearing joints without supervision." "I know you can, Foster. Your work is excellent, but the state inspector needs documentation showing that the engineer of record personally certified every critical connection. That's not a reflection on your competency. It's a regulatory requirement for emergency construction under CFR 1910.272. Foster nodded slowly. "All right, as long as it's documented that way, I can work with that arrangement." Calvin Merrick spoke from the back of the group. "Howard, what about me? What's my assignment?" "You're on the Bobcat T 870 first shift through 2 p.m. for excavation and site preparation. Then you transition to the Genie GTH-1056 telehandler from 2 p.m. until we stop for the day. The Genie work is critical. We're placing steel I-beams that weigh 1,800 pounds each. I need you to position them within a 1/4 inch of the placement marks. Can you do that?" I can do that. Howard looked at Landon. Landon, you're on the Lull 644E forklift across both shifts. You're working with Calvin on the I-beam placement. Landon lifts Calvin guides, and together you land each beam exactly where it needs to be. Quarter-inch tolerance. No exceptions. Landon nodded once. Within a quarter inch. Confirmed. Vincent, you're our materials coordinator. You source the steel, so you know the specifications on each beam. I need you to verify every I-beam before it goes into the structure. Check for stress cracks, corrosion dimension variations. If a beam doesn't meet spec, we don't use it. Vincent pulled a paper from his jacket pocket. I've got the mill certifications from Peterson Steel. All 12 beams are grade 50 steel and with certified load ratings. I'll verify each one visually before installation. Miles, you're installing the portable PTO conveyor at the gravity pit. The conveyor needs to be fully operational and bench tested at full capacity before Norris signs the final inspection Friday afternoon. Walk me through your installation timeline. Miles adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. Gravity pit excavation happens today. Concrete pour for the feed angle happens late this afternoon. Concrete cures overnight. Conveyor installation happens Friday morning. Bench testing happens Friday afternoon at 3 p.m. That gives us 2 hours to make adjustments before the 5 p.m. inspection. That's tight but workable. What do you need from the rest of us to make that timeline happen? I need the pit excavation to be exact. 4 feet deep, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, with the bottom excavated to accommodate the angle template I brought. Calvin's doing the excavation, so Calvin and I need to coordinate closely on the pit geometry. Calvin spoke up. I'll work directly with you on the excavation. Just tell me where you want the bucket and I'll put it there. Earl Tucker had been standing quietly to one side. Now he stepped forward. Howard, we need to talk about the emergency fund. The 7 men looked at Earl. The conversation about work assignments had been relatively straightforward. The conversation about money was going to be more complicated. Howard felt his chest tighten slightly. What about the fund? Current balance is $18,000. Your materials estimate is $24,820. We're short $6,820. Silence settled across the circle. A grain truck rolled past on Route 49, heading south toward Onarga, the driver probably trying to get in line at the Onarga elevator before the queue got too long. The truck's engine noise faded into the distance. Nash spoke first. His voice had an edge to it. Why is the fund short? Last balance report I saw we had $23,000. Earl kept his eyes on Howard, not on Nash. I authorized a loan to Mitchell Garrett's operation last month when his combine went down during harvest. About $5,000. Mitchell needed the repair completed within 48 hours, or he was going to lose his entire soybean crop. I didn't bring it to the club for a vote because there wasn't time to convene a meeting, and Mitchell needed an answer immediately. Nash's voice rose. The club bylaws require a vote on any withdrawal over $1,000. That's been the rule since the club was founded. You know that, Earl. I know the bylaws, Nash. I also know that Mitchell Garrett is a good man with a young family and a farm operation that was 6 hours away from financial catastrophe. I made a judgment call that the club's purpose is to help people in emergencies, and this qualified as an emergency. A judgment call that puts this project $6,800 in the hole before we even start, Nash said. That's not leadership. That's freelancing. That's making unilateral decisions that affect everyone. Foster Bryant looked at the ground and shook his head. Calvin shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Landon stood with his arms crossed, his face impassive. Vincent's expression remained neutral, but his jaw was tight. Miles adjusted his glasses and said nothing. The tension in the circle was building. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust and decision-making authority and the question of whether Earl had overstepped his role as club coordinator. Howard stepped into the center of the circle. Gentlemen, we can have this conversation about procedures and bylaws, and it's a conversation worth having. But we need to have it after this project is finished, not before we start. Right now, we have a more immediate problem. We need $7,000 to cover materials, and we need it today because suppliers won't deliver without payment. He let that sink in for a moment. Then he continued. The Cross Brand Club has built a reputation across this county over the past 11 years by showing up when emergencies happen in solving problems other people can't solve. We've rebuilt barns after fires. We've replaced equipment after failures. We've constructed temporary structures after disasters. If we walk away from this job because we're short $7,000, that reputation goes with us. Every farmer in Iroquois County will remember that when the co-op needed us, when 184 farms needed us, we couldn't figure out how to cover a $7,000 shortfall. Howard looked at each man in turn. Every man here has the option to walk right now. No judgment, no consequences. We'll shake hands and go our separate ways, and Cassidy will find some other solution. But if we stay, we find a way to cover the gap. And we do it in the next 5 minutes because we need to start excavation by 8 a.m. if we're going to hit our timeline. Vincent Shaw reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He walked to the tailgate of his truck, found a pen, and wrote for approximately 30 seconds. Then he tore out the check and handed it to Earl. $3,000. Consider it a loan to the emergency fund at 0% interest, payable when the club's cash flow allows. Calvin Merrick looked at Vincent, then at Earl. I'll cover $2,000. Same terms. 0% loan payable when the fund recovers. Miles Hartley nodded. I'll cover the remaining $1,820. The three men wrote checks and handed them to Earl. Earl folded the checks and put them in his wallet. The financial crisis was resolved. The project could move forward. But Nash Aldridge stood with his arms crossed, watching the transaction with an expression that was difficult to read. He turned to face Howard directly for the first time since arriving. Why would you put money into this? You're already taking the liability as engineer of record. You're already donating your time and expertise for the next 3 days. Why would you risk your own cash on top of that? Howard met Nash's eyes. Because if this ramp doesn't get built, I lose the same harvest revenue everyone else in this county loses. My 300 acres of standing corn doesn't move to market. My equipment loan payment comes out of savings instead of operating income. My medical bills get paid late because cash flow is tight. I'm in the same boat as every other farmer. Oh, here, Nash. This isn't charity. This is self-preservation. Nash held Howard's gaze for several seconds. Something shifted in his face. Not forgiveness exactly. Not reconciliation. But a recognition that the boundary dispute and the lost tuition money and the 16 months of silence were smaller things than the practical reality that 184 farms needed this ramp built before Saturday's rain. Nash looked at the ground, then back at Howard. Let's get to work. The tension in the circle broke. The 7 men moved toward their equipment and their assigned workstations. The conversation about Earl's unilateral decision and the club bylaws and the proper procedures for emergency fund withdrawals would happen eventually, but it would happen later after the immediate crisis was resolved. Norris Fletcher arrived at 8:54 a.m. in the white 2023 Ford F-150 with Illinois state plates. He climbed out of the truck, carrying the leather portfolio under his arm, and walked toward where Howard stood at the foundation footprint with a surveyor's tape measure and a bundle of wooden stakes. Mr. Brennan, I've reviewed the structural plans you faxed to my office last night. They're sound from an engineering perspective. The calculations check out. The load distribution is adequate. The safety factors are appropriate. Norris adjusted his reading glasses. I'm here to conduct the pre-work site inspection and issue the emergency permit if the site conditions support construction. The site's ready for your inspection. Norris spent the next 37 minutes walking the foundation footprint and examining the staging areas where materials and equipment were positioned. He measured the distance from the foundation to the rail loadout structure. He checked the grade of the existing ground surface. He examined the soil conditions in the areas where the foundation footers would be excavated. He inspected the steel I-beams on Vincent's trailer, checking the mill certification stamps and looking for obvious defects. He examined the oak timbers on Nash's trailer, measuring thickness and checking for rot or structural weakness. He inspected Foster's welding equipment, verifying that the generator had adequate output capacity and that the welding rig was properly maintained. He checked Calvin's Bobcat and Genie telehandler for current inspection certifications. He checked Landon's Lull forklift for the same. He examined Miles's portable conveyor system and reviewed the installation drawings for the gravity pit. At 9:28 a.m., Norris returned to where Howard stood with the other 6 men. Mr. Brennan, the site is approved for construction. The equipment meets standards. The materials are adequate. The engineering plans are sound. He pulled a document from his portfolio. This is the emergency construction permit issued under CFR 1910.272 grain handling provisions and Illinois State Code Section 8.245.3 temporary agricultural structures. The permit authorizes construction to begin immediately and continue through completion. He handed the permit to Howard. I'll return at 5 p.m. Friday for the final inspection. The inspection will take approximately 90 minutes and will cover all structural elements, all welded connections, all safety features, and all operational systems. If the structure passes inspection, you receive operational certification and can begin loading trucks Friday evening at 7 p.m. If the structure fails inspection, you'll have Friday night to make corrections and we'll conduct a re-inspection Saturday morning at 6 a.m. Norris paused and looked at Howard directly. Mr. Brennan, I need to be clear about something. I've inspected grain handling structures across Illinois for 18 years. An 84-foot drive-over ramp built in 32 hours would be the fastest emergency build I've ever certified. Most contractors take 6 weeks for this type of structure. You're proposing to do it in 3 days with volunteer labor. Don't make promises about timeline that you can't keep. I'm not promising timeline, Norris. I'm promising that when you return at 5 p.m. Friday, the structure will be complete and it will pass your inspection. Norris held Howard's gaze for a moment, then nodded once. We'll see on Friday. He climbed back into the F-150 and drove out of the lot. Earl walked over to where Howard stood holding the emergency permit. Howard, you just made a hell of a commitment to that inspector. I know what I committed to. If we don't finish by Friday at 5, or if the structure fails inspection, we're not just letting down Cassidy and the co-op. We're publicly failing in front of a state inspector who's going to document that failure and report it to the Agriculture Department. The Cross-Brand Club's reputation rides on this. Then we don't fail. Earl looked at Howard for a long moment. Then he turned to face the other 6 men who were standing nearby. You all heard what Howard just told the inspector. We're committing to complete this build in 32 hours and pass state inspection on the first try. Everyone understand what that means? 6 nods. All right then, Earl said. Calvin, start the excavation. Everyone else stage your materials and prep your equipment. We're starting the clock now. The 7 men began work at 9:47 a.m. under clear October sky. The temperature was climbing toward 52 degrees. Perfect construction weather, cool enough that physical labor didn't cause overheating, but warm enough that equipment operated efficiently and concrete would cure properly if they needed to pour any. Calvin ran the Bobcat T870 with the precision that came from 36 years of equipment operation. The Bobcat was a skid steer loader, which meant it could turn in its own length and could navigate tight spaces that larger equipment couldn't access. Calvin used it to excavate the foundation trenches, cutting through the compacted gravel-based layer to reach the undisturbed soil beneath. Howard had designed the foundation system with 6 primary load-bearing trenches running parallel to each other, spaced at 4-foot intervals, each trench 14 inches deep and 24 inches wide. The trenches would hold the steel I-beams that formed the structural skeleton of the ramp. The depth calculation was based on the compacted gravel base and the total anticipated load. The math held. 14 inches was adequate to distribute 80,000 pounds across the beam length without excessive settlement. Landon operated the Lull 644E rough terrain forklift with the smooth control of someone who'd spent decades handling heavy equipment in difficult conditions. The Lull was a telehandler forklift designed for construction sites and agricultural operations. It had 4-wheel drive rough terrain tires and a telescoping boom that could extend to reach elevated positions. Landon used it to stage the steel I-beams in precise sequence along the north side of the foundation footprint, positioning each beam so that when installation time came, they could be lifted and placed without repositioning the equipment. Nash directed his 2 hired hands in sorting and staging the oak decking boards. The boards were rough sawn, which meant they came straight from the sawmill without planing or finishing. The surfaces were textured and the dimensions varied slightly from board to board. Nash was sorting them by thickness, pulling out boards that were significantly over or under the 4-inch target dimension. The boards that made the cut were stacked in groups of 20, positioned near the lower section of the foundation, where they'd be installed once the I-beam framework was complete. Foster set up the welding rig, methodically running power lines from the portable generator to the Miller Trailblazer 325 welding machine. He checked the electrode supply, verified the shielding gas pressure, and tested the ground clamp connection. Welding equipment that wasn't properly set up could produce substandard welds, and substandard welds on a structure like this could mean failure under load. Foster was too professional to cut corners on setup. Vincent worked with Howard, inspecting every I-beam before it went into the foundation. They used calipers to verify thickness measurements at multiple points along each beam. They used visual inspection to check for stress cracks or corrosion that could compromise structural integrity. They checked the mill certification stamps to confirm that each beam was actually grade 50 steel as specified. This was tedious work, but it was critical. A single beam that didn't meet spec could cause failure of the entire structure. Miles assembled the components of his portable PDO conveyor system and began mapping out the installation sequence. The conveyor needed to connect to the gravity pit that would be excavated beneath the dump platform, and the connection angle had to be exactly 28 degrees for proper grain flow. Miles had brought the angle template he'd fabricated, and he spent time positioning it in various locations to determine the optimal placement for the pit excavation. By noon, the foundation excavation was complete. 6 parallel trenches ran from the starting point of the ramp toward the rail loadout structure, each trench cut to exact specifications. Calvin had worked straight through the morning without a break, focusing on getting the excavation perfect because everything else depended on having the foundation right. Earl brought sandwiches and thermoses of coffee from the Roberts 5FD auxiliary kitchen at 12:30 p.m. Margaret Brennan was coordinating the food service with 3 other women from the fire department auxiliary. They'd set up a tent with tables and chairs in a gravel area about 50 feet from the worksite. The smell of fresh coffee and hot sandwiches drifted across the lot. The 7 men ate standing or sitting on equipment. They didn't stop working. This wasn't a social meal. It was fuel consumption between work phases. Calvin ate his sandwich in the Bobcat cab while reviewing the next phase of excavation work that would create the approach ramp transition. Landon ate while walking the I-beam staging area, mentally rehearsing the lift sequences he'd need to execute when installation began. Nash ate while studying the oak decking layout Howard had sketched on butcher paper taped to the side of Vincent's trailer. Howard ate half a turkey sandwich and then drank black coffee while standing at the foundation site looking at what they'd accomplished in the first 3 hours. The excavation was done, the materials were staged, the equipment was positioned, they were ready to begin I-beam installation, which was the most critical phase of the entire build. At 1 p.m., Howard called the crew together at the foundation site. We're starting primary I-beam installation. This is where precision matters most. Every beam has to land within a 1/4 inch of the placement mark. Every connection point has to be clean and prepared properly for welding. Every weld has to meet commercial grade standards. We're not rushing this phase. We're working precisely and methodically. He looked at each man. The state inspector is coming back at 5 p.m. Friday. That's 28 hours from now. We need this foundation frame complete today. We need the upper section framed tomorrow morning. We need the decking and platform installed tomorrow afternoon. We need the gravity pit excavated and the conveyor installed tomorrow. And we need everything tested and verified before Norris shows up with his clipboard. That's an aggressive timeline, but it's achievable if we work smart and don't make mistakes that require rework. The first I-beam went into position at 1:14 p.m. Landon lifted it with the low forklift. The beam was 24 feet long and weighed 1,824 pounds, according to the mill certification. Landon's lift was smooth and controlled. No jerking, no swinging. The beam rose from the staging area and moved toward the first foundation trench with steady precision. Calvin stood at the trench edge with his hands raised, using standard construction hand signals to guide Landon's positioning. Left, right, forward, back, down slowly. The beam descended toward the trench. Calvin was watching the placement marks Howard had painted on the foundation floor. The beam needed to land with its center line directly over those marks within a 1/4 inch tolerance in both directions. Howard stood in the trench with a 4-foot level and a tape measure. His job was final verification before the beam settled into position. He called adjustments to Calvin, who relayed them to Landon. 2 inches forward, 1 inch right, 1/2 inch back. Good. Hold position, Down 6 inches, stop. Down 2 inches, stop. Perfect. Set it down. The beams settled into the footer trench at 1:22 p.m. Landon held position with the forklift while Howard checked alignment with the level. The beam was perfectly horizontal along its length. Perfect placement relative to the marks. Howard measured the distance from the beam's center line to the placement marks. 1/8 of an inch off on the north end, 1/16 of an inch off on the south end. Well within tolerance. Release, Howard called. Landon retracted the forklift. The beam sat in the trench held in place by its own weight and the friction against the trench walls. Howard climbed out of the trench and marked the end connection points with chalk. These were the locations where the beam would be welded to connection plates that would eventually support the cross bracing and the upper section framing. Foster, I need tack welds on both ends to hold position while we prep for the primary structural welds. Foster climbed into the trench with his welding helmet and the electrode holder. A tack weld was a small, quick weld used to hold components in position during assembly. It wasn't a structural weld. It was just enough heat and metal to keep things from moving while you set up for the real work. Foster made 2 quick tack welds, one on each end of the I-beam. Each weld took about 15 seconds. The welds glowed orange, then cooled to gray. The beam was now fixed in position and wouldn't shift during the preparation work. Howard waited 2 minutes for the metal to cool to a safe handling temperature, then checked alignment again with the level. Still perfect. The tack welds hadn't caused any distortion or movement. Good work, Foster. Now we prep for the primary structural weld. The primary structural weld was different from a tack weld in every way that mattered. Where a tack weld was quick and light, a structural weld was slow and heavy. Where a tack weld was just enough material to hold position, a structural weld deposited significant metal mass to create a connection that could handle full design loads. Where a tack weld could be done by anyone with basic welding skills, a structural weld required professional expertise and certification. Howard pulled on his welding helmet and fired the electrode. The arc lit with intense blue-white light. Howard began running a continuous weld bead along the first connection joint. He moved at steady speed, maintaining consistent arc length, depositing weld material in smooth, overlapping layers. The technique came back to him from his Caterpillar days. 12 years since he'd done this kind of work regularly, but the muscle memory held. The first primary weld took 11 minutes. Howard moved slowly and deliberately, focusing on maintaining proper technique. His chest felt tight from the overhead position and the heat from the welding arc, but the tightness wasn't getting worse. Dr. Holbrook's voice was in his head telling him to stop, but he pushed it aside. One weld. Just finish this one weld and then take a break. Howard lifted his helmet at 1:33 p.m. and inspected the weld bead. Clean, consistent, no slag inclusions, no porosity, no undercut. The weld looked like commercial grade work from a professional fabrication shop. Foster walked over and looked at it. That's quality welding, Howard. You haven't lost your touch. Thanks, but that took too long. 11 minutes per primary weld means we're looking at over an hour just for the connection welds on this first beam. We've got 6 beams in the foundation and each beam has 4 connection points. That's 24 welds. At 11 minutes per weld, we're looking at 4 hours and 24 minutes just for primary welding. We don't have that much time in the schedule. Foster looked at the weld, then at Howard. I can do those welds in 7 minutes each. Same quality, faster execution. That's 2 hours and 48 minutes total. Saves you an hour and 36 minutes. Howard hesitated. Dr. Holbrook's warning was clear, no sustained welding. But the project timeline was also clear. They needed the foundation frame complete by end of day. If Howard did all the primary welding himself, they wouldn't finish until after dark, which would push the entire schedule back and put the Friday inspection at risk. All right, Howard said, you execute the welds. I inspect and certify every one before we move to the next beam. If a weld doesn't meet spec, you redo it immediately. No arguments. Deal. Foster took over the welding. Howard watched the first complete weld cycle, inspecting Foster's technique. The arc was steady. The travel speed was consistent. The bead appearance was excellent. Foster had been welding professionally for 41 years, and it showed. His work was faster than Howard's and just as good. By 4 p.m., all 6 primary load-bearing I-beams were installed and welded in place. The foundation skeleton was complete. The structure was starting to take shape, steel beams rising from the gravel lot in parallel lines that would eventually support the oak decking and the dump platform. Nash's crew began installing the lower section oak decking at 4:15 p.m. They were laying 4-inch boards on 18-inch centers across the first 20 feet of the ramp structure. Each board had to be positioned precisely to maintain consistent spacing. Each board had to be fastened securely with lag bolts driven through pre-drilled holes. The work was methodical and time-consuming, but it went steadily. At 5:30 p.m., a white GMC Yukon pulled into the gravel lot and parked near the worksite. Garrett Voss climbed out. He wore khaki work pants and a company polo shirt with Voss Construction Services embroidered on the chest. He carried a professional camera with a large telephoto lens. Howard was 50 feet away supervising the decking installation when he saw Garrett arrive. He felt his chest tighten, not from physical exertion, but from the surge of anger that came with seeing his daughter's ex-husband show up unannounced at a construction site where Howard was trying to solve a community crisis. Garrett walked toward where Howard stood. "Howard, impressive work you're doing here." Howard straightened and pulled off his work gloves. "Garrett, I heard about the project. Heard you're building a grain ramp in 3 days with volunteer labor. That's ambitious." Garrett raised the camera and took several photos of the ramp structure. "Mind if I document the process for professional interest?" "It's Cassidy's property. Ask her." "Already did. She said as long as I stay out of the work zones, I'm free to observe and photograph." Garrett lowered the camera. "I actually came by to offer some advice. Professional to professional." "I'm listening." "I bid this job to Cassidy yesterday morning. Quoted $148,000 in 6 weeks timeline using a licensed construction crew with proper insurance and bonding. She turned me down, said she was going with an alternative solution." Garrett gestured at the partially completed ramp. "This is that solution, I'm guessing." "It is." "You got permits." "Emergency construction permit issued by the state this morning." "Liability insurance." "Covered through the Cross-Brand Club's general liability policy and Cassidy's property insurance." Garrett nodded slowly. "Howard, I'm going to give you some advice, whether you want it or not. You're building an agricultural structure on a compressed timeline with volunteer labor using equipment that wasn't designed for precision construction work. The risk factors are massive. If that structure fails during use, if a truck goes through the deck, if someone gets injured, the liability exposure is going to be catastrophic. And that liability is going to fall on you personally as the engineer of record. The structure won't fail. You can't know that. You're working outside your area of expertise, outside reasonable construction standards, and outside the normal safety protocols that exist for good reasons. I've been building structures for 23 years. I know what it takes to do this kind of work properly. And what you're doing here isn't proper. It's desperate and it's dangerous." Howard felt his anger rising but kept his voice level. "Is there a point to this conversation, Garrett? The point is that when this goes wrong, and I believe it will go wrong, there will be consequences. Legal consequences, financial consequences, and those consequences are going to impact your family. They're going to impact Claire and Dylan. As Dylan's father, I have a responsibility to monitor situations that might affect his well-being and his mother's stability." Now Howard understood. This wasn't about construction safety or proper engineering practices. This was Garrett creating a pretext to challenge Claire's custody arrangement. If the ramp project failed, Garrett would use that failure as evidence that Howard was reckless and that Claire's judgment was compromised by her association with Howard. "Garrett, this project is protecting Claire and Dylan's financial future. That corn sitting in bins across this county represents their security just as much as it represents everyone else's. If we don't build this ramp, a lot of families, including ours, take financial losses we might not recover from. That's the real risk to Dylan's well-being, not the construction project, the economic consequences of doing nothing." Garrett raised the camera again and took more photos. "I'm documenting everything, Howard. Timeline, methods, personnel. When this fails, I'll have a complete record of how it happened and who was responsible." He walked back to the Yukon and drove out of the lot at 5:47 p.m. Earl walked over to where Howard stood watching the Yukon disappear down Route 49. "That looked unpleasant. Garrett thinks we're taking irresponsible risks. He's documenting the project so he can use it against Claire in a custody fight." Garrett lost a $148,000 contract to 7 farmers with equipment and determination. He's trying to undermine what we're doing because his ego can't handle the rejection. Howard looked at Earl. What if he's not wrong, though? What if we are operating outside our depth? What if something does go wrong and someone gets hurt? Earl was quiet for a moment. Howard, every man on this project has decades of experience in his specialty. Calvin's been running heavy equipment since he was 16 years old. Landon's a Marine Corps combat engineer with multiple deployments. Foster's a certified welder with 41 years of professional work. Vincent ran a fabrication business for 34 years. You were a structural welding crew lead at Caterpillar. We're not amateurs trying to play contractor. We're professionals who happen to farm. Then why does Garrett's argument feel like it has weight? Because Garrett's smart enough to identify a real concern and frame it in a way that sounds reasonable. Yes, there's risk in what we're doing. Yes, someone could get injured. Yes, the structure could fail. But those risks exist on every construction project. The difference is that Garrett wants you to believe we're not qualified to manage those risks. And that's where he's wrong. We're as qualified as any contractor he'd hire. The only difference is we're doing it for community benefit instead of commercial profit. Howard nodded slowly. All right, let's finish the foundation work before we lose daylight. The crew worked until 9:47 p.m. under portable work lights powered by Foster's generator. The lights cast harsh shadows across the worksite, making everything look stark and industrial. By the time they stopped for the night, the foundation frame was complete with all 6 primary I-beams welded in place, and the lower section decking was 60% installed. Howard stood in the gravel lot looking at what they'd accomplished. One day's work. The structure was maybe 35% complete. They needed to be at 100% by 5 p.m. Friday. That was approximately 20 hours away. 20 hours to build the upper section frame, complete the decking installation, excavate the gravity pit, pour the concrete feed angle, install the conveyor system, and test everything at full capacity. The timeline was tight, but still achievable if nothing went wrong. And that was the gamble, that nothing would go wrong, no equipment failures, no material defects discovered late in the process, no injuries that pulled a critical crew member out of action, no weather changes that disrupted the schedule, no mistakes that required time-consuming rework. Earl walked over and stood beside Howard. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we're one mechanical failure away from missing the deadline. If Calvin's Bobcat throws a hydraulic line tomorrow, we lose hours. If Landon's forklift has electrical problems, we're stuck. If Foster's welder overheats and needs to cool down, we're delayed. So we build in redundancy where we can. Calvin brings backup hydraulic lines. Landon brings spare electrical components. Foster runs the welder at 75% duty cycle instead of pushing it to maximum. We plan for problems before they happen. That's good thinking. Earl was quiet for a moment. Howard, how's your chest? And don't tell me it's fine. I watched you today. You're moving slower than usual. You're taking more breaks. Margaret's going to ask me when I get home whether you're following Dr. Holbrook's advice. What should I tell Ruth? Tell Ruth that Howard Brennan is being as smart about this as he can be. Tell her I let Foster do most of the welding today. Tell her I'm supervising more than I'm working. Tell her I'm listening to my body and taking breaks when I need to. And is that true? Mostly. Earl nodded. That's what I'll tell her. See you at 6 a.m. Howard drove home at 10:23 p.m. with Margaret in the passenger seat. She'd stayed at the site through the evening, running the food service tent with the other VFD auxiliary women. They'd serve dinner at 6 and coffee and snacks at 8, and they'd be back tomorrow morning at 7 to start the whole cycle again. They didn't speak during the 15-minute drive. When Howard pulled into the farmhouse driveway and shut off the engine, Margaret turned to face him. How's your chest? It's fine. Howard, he looked at her. It's tight, but it's been tight all day. It's stress tension, not cardiac. My vision is clear. My breathing is normal. I'm not experiencing any of the warning signs Dr. Holbrook described. And if it gets worse, then I'll stop. I promised you I'd stop if it got worse. I'm keeping that promise. Margaret reached across and took his hand. I watched you today. You were welding. You told me you were going to supervise only. I did one weld to verify my technique. After that, Foster did all the primary welding. I just inspected and certified his work. One weld that took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of overhead welding with your arms raised and your chest compressed and your heart working harder than it should. Howard didn't have a good response to that. I'm sorry, you're right. I shouldn't have done that weld. Promise me you won't do any more welding tomorrow. Foster's work is good. Let him do it. I promise. They sat in the truck in the dark driveway. The farmhouse windows glowed warm with interior light. Claire had left the porch light on. Through the kitchen window, Howard could see Dylan at the table, probably finishing homework or drawing pictures before bed. Margaret, what if Garrett's right? What if this project does fail and someone gets hurt? Then we deal with it. We call ambulances. We file insurance claims. We learn from what went wrong and we do better next time. But that's not going to happen, Howard. You're too careful. The other men are too experienced. You're building this structure the right way. I hope you're right. I am right. Now let's go inside. Dylan wants to show you a picture he drew of the ramp. The alarm in Howard Brennan's bedroom went off at 4:47 a.m. Friday morning, October 18th. He'd slept 4 hours and 12 minutes. His chest still felt tight when he sat up on the edge of the bed. The tightness wasn't worse than yesterday, but it wasn't better either. It was just there, a constant reminder that his heart wasn't working the way it should. Margaret was already awake, sitting in the chair by the window. She'd changed into work clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, and the denim jacket she wore when she was going to spend the day outside. How long have you been up? Howard asked. Since 3:30. Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about everything that could go wrong today. Howard stood and walked to the window. The October darkness outside showed no hint of dawn yet. The weather forecast remained unchanged from yesterday, clear through early afternoon. Rain moving in from the southwest by 6 p.m., projected accumulation of 2 to 3 inches overnight. The rain would arrive approximately 1 hour after the state inspector finished his examination and either certified the structure for operation or rejected it as inadequate. We have 13 hours, Howard said. Norris inspects at 5 p.m. If we pass, trucks start loading at 7 p.m. If we fail, we work through the night making corrections and re-inspect at 6 a.m. Saturday morning. Margaret stood beside him. And if you have a cardiac episode sometime in those 13 hours, then Earl takes over and the club finishes without me. Howard, I need you to promise me something. This is different from yesterday's promise. This is more specific. She turned to face him. If your chest gets worse, if your vision blurs, if you feel lightheaded or nauseous, or if you have pain radiating down your left arm, you stop immediately. You don't wait to see if it passes. You don't finish the task you're working on. You stop that instant and you tell someone what you're feeling. Do you understand? I understand. Say it back to me. If I experience cardiac symptoms, I stop immediately and tell someone. And you mean it. I mean it, Margaret. I want to be alive at the end of this to see Dylan grow up. I'm not going to be stupid about chest pain. She searched his face for several seconds, then nodded. All right, let's get through today. By 5:53 a.m., all 7 cross-brand club members were back at the Roberts loadout site. The portable work lights were already running off Foster's generator, casting harsh illumination across the partially completed ramp structure. Calvin had the Genie telehandler positioned to lift the upper section I-beams into place. Landon had the Lowell forklift staged with the first beam already secured in the forks, ready to begin the upper section framing as soon as Howard gave the signal. Howard gathered the 6 men at the foundation. The morning was cold, mid-30s, and everyone's breath was visible in the work lights. Today we complete the upper section frame, install the dump platform, excavate, and line the gravity pit, install Miles's conveyor, and finish all oak decking. Norris inspects at 5 p.m. That's 11 hours from now. Every minute counts. Foster Bryant stepped forward. The lights cast shadows on his face that made him look older than 63. Howard, I need to say something before we start. Howard waited. I've been welding for 41 years. I've worked with a lot of engineers and a lot of crew leads. Most of them treated welders like hired hands who were expected to follow orders without question. They didn't explain the engineering. They didn't show respect for the craft. They just pointed at joints and expected you to make them stick. Foster paused. You don't do that. You explain why each weld matters. You show respect for the skill it takes to do quality work. You trust us to execute properly while maintaining appropriate oversight. That's leadership. He looked at Calvin. 3 years ago, Calvin and I had a physical altercation over something that didn't matter. We haven't spoken civilly since then. We've avoided working together. We've maintained cold distance because neither of us wanted to be the first to apologize. Foster extended his hand toward Calvin. Calvin, I apologize for holding a grudge for 3 years. You're a good man and a good equipment operator. I'm glad to be working beside you on this project. Calvin looked at Foster's extended hand, then at Foster's face. The moment stretched out. Then Calvin reached forward and shook Foster's hand. Apology accepted, Foster. I said things 3 years ago that I shouldn't have said, things I regret. I'm glad we're past it. The two men held the handshake for several seconds, then released. The tension that had existed between them for 3 years dissolved in that moment. It didn't erase what had happened, but it acknowledged that continuing to carry that grudge was more burdensome than the original offense. Howard looked at the 6 men standing in the cold morning. Gentlemen, the Cross Brand Club works because we choose to show up for each other when it matters. Not just with equipment and labor, but with trust and respect and willingness to work through conflicts. Today matters. Let's get to work. The 7 men worked through the morning without stopping. The upper section I-beams went into place with the same precision as the foundation beams. Landon lifted each beam with the Lull forklift. Calvin guided it into position with the Genie telehandler. Howard and Foster worked as a synchronized team on the structural welds, Howard marking and inspecting, Foster executing with consistent quality. By 9:14 a.m., the upper section frame was complete. The ramp structure now rose from ground level to the 14-foot dump platform across 84 feet of horizontal run. The skeletal frame was in place. The load-bearing engineering was done. Now came the detailed finish work that would turn the skeleton into a functional structure. Nash's crew worked steadily on the oak decking, moving from the lower section into the middle section and up toward the upper platform. Each board was positioned precisely. Each board was fastened securely. The work was methodical and time-consuming, but it was progressing at the rate Howard had calculated. They'd be finished with decking by early afternoon, which would leave time for the final platform railings and safety features. At 9:30 a.m., Howard was marking weld points on a cross brace when he saw Vincent Shaw standing beside his truck with one hand braced against the tailgate. Vincent's face was pale. His breathing was shallow. Howard set down the chalk and walked quickly across the gravel lot. Vincent. Vincent looked up. There was sweat on his forehead despite the morning temperature being in the low 50s. His left hand was pressed against his lower back. I'm all right, just needed a moment to catch my breath. Howard moved closer. How long have you been fighting the pain? Vincent was silent for several seconds. His jaw was tight. His eyes showed the kind of exhaustion that came from weeks of inadequate sleep and chronic discomfort. 4 months, since June. What's the diagnosis? Prostate cancer. Stage 3, I start radiation therapy in November. Howard felt something cold settle in his stomach. Does Elena know? She knows, no one else. I didn't want it to become a thing, didn't want people treating me differently, didn't want sympathy or special accommodations. Vincent, you should be resting. You shouldn't be hauling 8 tons of steel I-beams and working construction sites. You should be conserving your strength for the treatment ahead. Howard, I spent 34 years building a welding and fabrication business in this county. I know every steel supplier within 100 miles. I have relationships with these people that go back decades. When you needed steel, I-beams sourced and delivered on 24 hours notice, I made 3 phone calls and had them at my shop by Wednesday afternoon. Vincent straightened slightly, though the movement clearly cost him. Peterson Steel charged cost plus 5%. That's $14,800. A commercial supplier without personal relationships would have charged $25,000 or $30,000. I saved Cassidy $10,000 with 3 phone calls. That's my contribution to this project. That's what I can still do despite the cancer. And what's it costing you physically? How much pain are you in right now? Enough that I needed to stop and rest. Not enough that I can't keep working. Howard studied Vincent's face. The gray pallor, the tension around the eyes, the way he was breathing through his teeth to manage the pain. Vincent, I need you to be honest with me. On a scale of 1 to 10, where's your pain right now? 7, maybe 8, and yesterday 5, maybe 6. So it's getting worse. It gets worse when I do physical work. Then it gets better when I rest. That's how chronic pain works, Howard. You manage it. You don't surrender to it. Earl appeared beside them. He'd been supervising Nash's decking crew and had noticed Vincent's absence. What's happening? Vincent has stage 3 prostate cancer, Howard said. He's been working through it for 4 months. The pain's getting worse. Earl looked at Vincent with an expression that was hard to read. Not surprise exactly, more like a puzzle piece falling into place. The weight loss, I noticed but didn't want to ask. 32 pounds since June, Vincent said. Hormone therapy side effect. Vincent, we're calling Elena. She's going to come get you and take you home, or take you to the hospital if that's what's needed. If I leave, who's going to verify the steel? Who's going to catch a defective beam before it goes into the structure? I'll do it, Earl said. I've been working with steel for 40 years. I'm not as expert as you, but I can identify obvious defects. We'll manage without you. Vincent shook his head. You're not hearing me. I can manage the pain for one more day. After that, I'll rest. After that, I'll do whatever Elena and the doctors tell me to do. But today I'm staying. Today I'm contributing. Howard and Earl looked at each other. They were having a silent conversation about whether to force the issue, whether to physically put Vincent in a vehicle and drive him home, whether to override his autonomy in the name of protecting his health. All right, Howard said finally. You stay, but you sit down. You don't lift anything. You don't climb on equipment. You don't do physical labor. You supervise from a chair in the shade. If the pain gets to 9 or 10, you tell us immediately. Agreed. Agreed. And after today, you take care of yourself. You focus on treatment and recovery. The Cross Brand Club will be here when you're healthy again. I appreciate that, Howard. Vincent walked slowly back toward the work site. Earl watched him go, then turned to Howard. He's not going to make it through the day without medical attention. I know, but he needs to make that decision himself. If we force him to leave, we take away his dignity. If we let him stay until he can't continue anymore, he maintains agency over his own life. And if he collapses, then we call an ambulance and we live with knowing we should have called it sooner. At 11:47 a.m., the dump platform was installed. The platform measured 24 feet by 16 feet, constructed from steel I-beam framing with oak decking. The platform sat at exactly 14 feet above ground level. The elevation had been verified 3 times with surveying equipment to ensure it matched the height of the existing rail loadout system. A truck would drive up the ramp, position itself over the gravity pit opening in the center of the platform, and dump its load through the opening into the pit below. From there, Miles's conveyor would carry the grain up into the rail loadout chute and into the waiting rail car. The entire system was designed for efficiency and safety. The platform had railings on 3 sides to prevent vehicles from driving off the edges. The 4th side was open to allow trucks to drive up and then reverse back down after dumping. By 1:23 p.m., the gravity pit excavation was complete. Calvin had used the Bobcat to dig a pit that measured 12 feet long by 8 feet wide by 4 feet deep. The pit was positioned directly beneath the center of the dump platform. Miles had installed his angle template at the bottom of the pit, setting it at precisely 28 degrees from horizontal. Miles called Howard over at 1:38 p.m. Howard, I need you to verify this angle before we pour concrete. Once the concrete is down, we can't easily adjust it. Howard climbed into the pit with a digital level. He placed the level on the angle template and checked the reading. 28.1 degrees, within 1/10 of 1 degree of the target specification. That's perfect, Miles. You can start prepping for the concrete pour. I'll need 2 hours for the pour and initial set. Concrete will be workable until about 4 p.m. Then it needs to cure undisturbed overnight. The conveyor installation happens first thing Saturday morning. Howard checked his watch. 1:41 p.m. The concrete pour would take them to approximately 3:45 p.m. That left 1 hour and 15 minutes before Norris Fletcher arrived for the final inspection at 5 p.m. It was going to be tight, but it was workable. Start the pour at 2 p.m. I'll coordinate with Nash's crew to make sure we're not doing any heavy equipment work nearby that could vibrate the concrete while it's setting. At 2 p.m., a white GMC Yukon pulled into the gravel lot for the 2nd day in a row. Garrett Voss climbed out carrying the same professional camera he'd had yesterday. He walked toward where Howard was supervising the concrete pour preparation. Howard saw him coming and felt the anger rise in his chest immediately. He didn't have time for whatever Garrett was going to say. They were 3 hours away from the state inspection, and every minute counted. Garrett stopped about 10 feet away and raised the camera. He took several photos of the completed ramp structure, the dump platform, the gravity pit excavation. Howard, impressive progress since yesterday. You might actually pull this off. Did you come here to take pictures or to tell me something? Both. Garrett lowered the camera. I came to tell you that I've been documenting this project for my own records. Timeline, methods, personnel, safety protocols, or lack thereof. He paused. I've also been talking to people, farmers who are watching this project, co-op board members, town officials, getting their perspectives on what you're doing here. What's your point, Garrett? My point is that when this is all over, whether the structure passes inspection or fails, whether it operates safely or collapses, I'm going to write a detailed report about how this project was conducted. That report might find its way to OSHA. It might find its way to the Illinois Department of Labor. It might find its way to the state licensing board that oversees structural engineers. Garrett raised the camera again. I want to make sure everyone understands exactly what happened here. How volunteer labor with minimal oversight attempted to build critical infrastructure in 72 hours. Howard felt his chest tighten. Not from cardiac stress, from pure rage. You're threatening to file regulatory complaints because I cost you a contract. I'm documenting a project that I believe represents unsafe construction practices. If that documentation leads to regulatory inquiries, that's a consequence of your choices, not mine. Garrett, is there thing specific you want? Because I have a concrete pour starting in 10 minutes and a state inspection in 3 hours. I don't have time for whatever game you're playing. Garrett put the camera away and pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. I'm not playing a game, Howard. I'm protecting my son's interests. This document is a notice of intent to file for emergency custody modification. I'm filing it with the court Monday morning. The basis for the filing is that Claire's judgment has become compromised due to her close association with you and your increasingly reckless behavior. The ramp project is Exhibit A. Your cardiac condition and refusal to follow medical advice is Exhibit B. The financial instability of the farm operation is Exhibit C. Howard stared at the document. You're using this project to try to take Dylan away from Claire. I'm using this project as evidence that Claire's living situation and support system are unstable. The court will make its own determination about custody. I'm just providing the facts. Get off this property, Garrett. I'm on co-op property, not your property, and Cassidy gave me permission to observe. I'll leave when I'm finished documenting. Garrett walked back to the Yukon and drove to a position about 50 yards away where he had a clear view of the entire worksite. He positioned himself to watch and photograph the final 3 hours of work before the state inspection. Earl walked over to where Howard stood. What did he say? He's filing for emergency custody modification Monday morning, using this project as evidence that Claire's judgment is compromised. That's complete. Earl stopped himself. Howard, Garrett's trying to get in your head. He's trying to make you angry and distracted during the most critical phase of the build. Don't let him do that. I'm not letting him do anything. He's doing it whether I let him or not. Then ignore him. Focus on the work. The best way to defeat Garrett is to complete this project successfully and prove that his concerns were unfounded. If the ramp passes inspection and operates safely, his custody filing has no foundation. Howard nodded slowly. You're right. Let's finish this. The concrete pour started at 2:03 p.m. Miles had ordered 6 yards of concrete from a ready-mix supplier in Watseka. The concrete truck arrived at 2 p.m. and backed up to the gravity pit. The concrete was a standard structural mix with fiber reinforcement for crack resistance. Miles supervised the pour personally using a vibrating tool to eliminate air pockets and ensure proper consolidation. The concrete flowed into the pit and over the angled template, creating a smooth sloped surface at exactly 28 degrees. The pour was complete by 2:47 p.m. Now we wait, Miles said. Concrete needs 4 hours minimum before we can walk on it, 12 hours before we can put equipment on it. We're cutting it close on the timeline, but it'll work. At 3:15 p.m., Nash's crew completed the oak decking installation. Every board was in place. Every fastener was secured. The ramp surface was complete from ground level to the dump platform. Howard walked the entire length of the ramp, checking board spacing and fastener tightness. Everything looked good. At 3:42 p.m., Foster completed the final safety railing welds. The railings ran along both sides of the ramp and around three sides of the dump platform. They were constructed from 2-inch steel pipe, welded to vertical posts every 8 feet. The railings were 42 inches high, which was standard industrial safety height. Howard inspected every railing weld. Foster's work was consistently excellent. Clean beads, full penetration, no defects. The railings would hold if a vehicle made contact with them, which was the safety standard they needed to meet. At 4:17 p.m., Howard was conducting a final walkthrough of the entire structure when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Claire. "Dad, I need you to come home right now." Howard looked at his watch, 4:17 p.m. The state inspector was arriving in 43 minutes. "Claire, I can't leave. Norris Fletcher is inspecting at 5 o'clock. If I'm not here, he might consider the engineer of record unavailable and delay the certification." "Dad, Garrett's here. He came to the house with papers from his lawyer. He's threatening to file for emergency custody modification Monday morning. He's claiming I'm unstable and that Dylan's being exposed to unsafe conditions because of you in this ramp project. He's saying if you don't stop the construction immediately and issue a public statement accepting responsibility for endangering the community, he'll file the motion and push for immediate supervised visitation restrictions." Howard closed his eyes. Of course Garrett was doing this now. Of course he was creating maximum pressure at the exact moment when Howard couldn't respond. 43 minutes before the state inspection. No time to drive home. No time to deal with Garrett face to face. No time to do anything except choose between family and community obligation. "Claire, where are you right now?" "I'm in the kitchen. Garrett's in the driveway. Mom's here. Dylan's upstairs in his room. He knows something's wrong, but he doesn't know what." "Put Mom on the phone." There was a pause, then Margaret's voice. "Howard Garrett Voss is standing in our driveway with a legal document claiming Claire is an unfit mother because she's exposing Dylan to the unsafe environment of your construction project. He says he's been documenting the project for 2 days. He says he has photos and statements that prove you're operating recklessly. He's demanding that you immediately cease work, issue a public statement accepting responsibility for endangering the community, and acknowledge that the project should have been handled by licensed professionals." "Margaret, what happens if I do what he's asking?" "Then you abandon the project 43 minutes before the state inspection. You prove Garrett's point that the build was irresponsible by walking away at the critical moment. And Garrett uses that abandonment as evidence in his custody filing that your judgment is compromised and that Claire's judgment is compromised by extension because she supports you. And if I don't do what he's asking," then he files the custody motion Monday morning with all the documentation he's collected. And Claire spends the next 3 months fighting in court instead of building her new job at the co-op. Howard stood in the gravel lot with the phone against his ear, and 43 minutes until the state inspection that would determine whether 184 farms could move their grain to market or whether all of them would take significant financial losses that some wouldn't survive. Margaret put Claire back on the phone. There was another pause, then Claire's voice. "Dad, Claire, listen to me carefully. Garrett is using Dylan as leverage to stop this project. He's doing it now 43 minutes before the state inspection because he knows I can't respond. He knows I can't drive home. He knows I can't confront him face to face. He's creating a situation where I have to choose between you and the project, and he's counting on me to choose you. Dad, I don't want you to choose. I want you to finish the project." "Are you sure?" "Yes, because if you leave now, Garrett wins everything. He forces you to abandon the project, which proves his point about reckless judgment. He gets evidence for his custody filing. He undermines what you've spent 3 days building. And he teaches Dylan that when someone threatens you, you surrender." Claire's voice was steady. "I'm not surrendering, Dad. I'm going to fight Garrett's custody motion with my own lawyer. With evidence that you built this ramp properly, that it passed state inspection, that it operated safely. That evidence will show the court that Garrett's concerns were manufactured for litigation purposes. Claire, that's going to be expensive. Lawyers, court fees, expert witnesses. Then I'll borrow money. I'll work extra shifts. I'll do whatever it takes. But I won't let Garrett use threats to control my life anymore." She paused. Dad, you taught me something these past 3 days. You taught me that you show up when it matters, that you don't quit when things get hard, that you do what needs to be done even when it's difficult and scary. I'm applying that lesson right now. I'm showing up for my son. I'm not quitting. Howard felt his throat tighten. I'm proud of you, Claire. Finish the project, Dad. Pass the inspection. Prove Garrett wrong. Howard ended the call and stood holding the phone. Earl walked over. Problem. Garrett went to the house. He's threatening Claire with immediate custody modification if I don't abandon the project right now. What did Claire say? She told me to finish the project, to pass the inspection, to prove him wrong. Earl looked at Howard for a long moment. Your daughter's tougher than Garrett expected. She's tougher than I expected. At 4:58 p.m., Norris Fletcher's white Ford F-150 pulled into the gravel lot. He parked near the base of the ramp and climbed out carrying the leather portfolio. Howard walked to meet him with the other 6 cross-brand club members following. Mr. Brennan, I'm here to conduct the final inspection of the temporary drive-over ramp structure. The structure is ready for inspection, Norris. Norris pulled a checklist from his portfolio. The inspection will cover structural frame integrity, welded connection quality, decking installation, and fastening safety railings, gravity pit dimensions, and concrete work, access, angles, and approach transitions, load distribution and foundation stability, and overall compliance with CFR 1910.272 grain handling provisions. The inspection will take approximately 90 minutes. I'll document every element. If the structure passes, you receive operational certification effective immediately. If it fails, I'll document the deficiencies and you'll have tonight to make corrections before we re-inspect at 6 a.m. Saturday. Understood. Norris began the inspection at 5:01 p.m. He started at the foundation, examining each primary I-beam connection with a magnifying glass and a bright LED flashlight. He was looking for weld defects, cracks, porosity incomplete, fusion undercut overlap. Any defect that could compromise the structural integrity of the connection. He spent 17 minutes on the foundation welds. He took photographs. He made notes on his checklist. He didn't speak except to occasionally ask Howard technical questions about the design calculations or the material specifications. At 5:18 p.m., Norris moved to the oak decking. He measured board spacing with his steel tape measure, checking multiple locations across the ramp surface. He checked fastener installation, looking for stripped screw heads or improperly seated lag bolts. He walked the entire length of the ramp, bouncing slightly on each step to test for flex or loose boards. At 5:47 p.m., Norris examined the dump platform and the safety railings. He checked railing height. He checked railing strength by pushing hard against the top rail. He checked the spacing between railings to ensure a person couldn't accidentally fall through. He examined the gravity pit opening to verify it was properly positioned and dimensioned. At 6:02 p.m., Norris measured the ramp grade using a digital inclinometer. He took readings at 10 different points along the ramp length. Every reading came back between 11.8 and 12.2% grade, within acceptable tolerance. At 6:14 p.m., Norris examined the gravity pit concrete work. The concrete was still curing and couldn't be walked on, but Norris could verify the angle visually and check the surface quality. He knelt at the edge of the pit and used his inclinometer to measure the feed angle, 28.1 degrees, exactly as specified. At 6:24 p.m., Norris pulled his white F-150 onto the approach transition and drove up the ramp at normal speed. The truck weighed approximately 6,400 pounds. The oak decking didn't flex visibly. The I-beam structure didn't shift. Norris drove to the dump platform, stopped the truck, engaged the emergency brake, and climbed out. He walked around the platform, checking for any signs of stress or movement. He examined the railings from the elevated position. He looked down into the gravity pit to verify alignment between the pit opening and the dump position. Then he climbed back into the F-150 and drove back down the ramp. At 6:31 p.m., Norris returned to where Howard and the other 6 men stood waiting at the base of the ramp. The October sun was setting. The temperature had dropped into the low 50s. The first clouds from tomorrow's storm system were visible on the southwestern horizon. Norris pulled the inspection checklist from his portfolio and made several final notes. He wrote for approximately 45 seconds. Then he looked up. Mr. Brennan, I've completed the inspection. The structure meets all requirements under CFR 1910.272 grain handling provisions and Illinois State Emergency Construction Protocols. He pulled a certificate from his portfolio and handed it to Howard. The certificate was printed on official Illinois Department of Agriculture letterhead with Norris's signature and stamp at the bottom. This certifies that the temporary grain loadout structure at the Iroquois County Cooperative Roberts facility has passed final inspection and is approved for commercial operation effective immediately. You can begin loading trucks at 7 p.m. tonight. Howard took the certificate. His hands were steady. His chest was still tight, but the pain hadn't worsened. Thank you, Norris. Mr. Brennan, I need to say something off the record. Norris glanced at the other 6 men, then back at Howard. I've inspected 184 grain handling structures in 18 years with the Illinois Department of Agriculture. I've seen work from the best contractors in the state. I've seen million-dollar installations with engineering teams and quality control specialists and extensive testing protocols. He paused. This 7-man build in 32 hours is the cleanest emergency construction job I've ever certified. The wells are commercial grade. The oak decking is precision work. The gravity pit is engineered correctly. The safety features exceed minimum requirements. You built something in 2 days that most contractors couldn't build in 6 weeks, and you built it better than most of them would have. Norris looked at the other 6 men. Gentlemen, I'm filing this inspection report with the USDA as a precedent emergency build under federal grain handling regulations. Iroquois County becomes the case study for emergency loadout reconstruction. When other counties face elevator collapses, they'll reference this project. Your work here is setting standards. Earl Tucker stepped forward. What does that mean practically? It means the USDA is going to want to study how you did this. They're going to want to document your methods. They're probably going to invite you to present at regional conferences. This is significant work that has implications beyond just solving Iroquois County's immediate problem. Norris shook Howard's hand, then each of the other 6 men's hands. Congratulations, gentlemen. You did exceptional work. He climbed into the F-150 and drove out of the lot at 6:38 p.m. The 7 men stood in a loose circle at the base of the ramp. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The magnitude of what they'd accomplished was settling over them. 32 hours of intensive construction work, 7 men with 7 specializations working at the edge of their capabilities. And they'd done it. They'd built a structure that passed state inspection on the first try. Calvin broke the silence. We actually did it. We did it, Earl confirmed. Foster looked at Howard. You designed it right. Every measurement, every calculation, every specification. The engineering was perfect. The execution was perfect, Howard said. I designed it, but you all built it. Foster's welds, Calvin's equipment operation, Landon's precision placement, Nash's decking work, Vincent's materials coordination, Miles's conveyor engineering, Earl's leadership. This was a team success. At 6:42 p.m., Howard called Vincent's cell phone. Elena answered. Howard, this is Elena. Vincent asked me to answer his phone because he's being examined by the ER doctor right now. Howard's chest tightened. What happened? Vincent collapsed at home about an hour ago. He said he worked through the day despite severe pain. He said he waited until the state inspection was complete before he let me drive him to the hospital. The doctor is running tests now. We should have results in the next hour. Elena, I'm sorry. I should have forced him to stop. I should have called an ambulance this morning. Howard, Vincent told me what you said to him. That he should rest. That he should go home. That he should focus on his health. He chose to stay. That was his decision, not yours. Don't take responsibility for a grown man's choices. How bad is it? The doctor says it's severe muscle strain in the lumbar region, possibly exacerbated by the cancer, but not directly caused by it. They're doing imaging to make sure there's no structural damage. Vincent wanted me to tell you that if the ramp didn't pass inspection, he's coming back tomorrow to help make corrections. Howard felt his eyes water. Tell Vincent the ramp passed. Tell him he doesn't need to come back tomorrow. Tell him to rest and focus on getting ready for radiation treatment. I'll tell him. Howard, Vincent also wanted me to tell you that working on this project meant something to him. That being able to contribute despite the cancer proved to himself that he's not done yet. that he's still useful, that he still matters. Vincent absolutely matters. He saved us $10,000 on steel. He coordinated materials delivery on impossible timelines. He verified quality on every beam before installation. We couldn't have done this without him. Thank you for saying that. I'll let you know when we have test results. At 6:58 p.m., the first grain truck rolled into the Roberts loadout gravel lot. The driver was Tom Hendricks, 54 years old, farming 8 miles north of Roberts. Tom climbed down from the cab of his Peterbilt 389, pulling a B-train configuration loaded with 1,000 bushels of wet corn. Tom walked toward where Howard stood at the base of the ramp. "Howard heard you boys built a ramp in 3 days. That true?" "That's true, Tom. And it passed state inspection. Passed an hour ago. We're certified for operations starting right now." Tom looked at the ramp structure rising against the evening sky. "I've been hauling corn for 32 years. Seen a lot of grain handling operations. This is impressive work." He walked back to his truck. "All right, if I drive up." "That's what we built it for. Drive up to the platform and position over the pit opening. You'll see the markers. Dump your load into the pit. The conveyor will carry it up to the rail loadout." Tom climbed into the Peterbilt and started the engine. The diesel rumbled. The exhaust stacks puffed black smoke. The loaded truck weighed 76,000 pounds, 40,000 pounds of truck, and trailer, 36,000 pounds of corn. Tom put the truck in gear and rolled slowly toward the ramp approach. The transition from flat ground to the inclined ramp was smooth. No jarring, no scraping. Tom shifted gears and the truck climbed the 12% grade steadily. The oak decking held without flexing. The I-beam structure held without shifting. At the dump platform, Tom positioned the truck over the gravity pit opening. The pit markers were clearly visible. Tom aligned the truck carefully, then engaged the dump hydraulics. The trailer bed rose. The tailgate opened. 1,000 bushels of wet yellow corn poured out in a sustained flow lasting 42 seconds. The corn dropped through the pit opening and landed on the 28-degree concrete angle Miles had poured that afternoon. The corn flowed smoothly into the conveyor feed that Miles had installed during the final inspection. The conveyor carried the corn up at the calculated angle, transferred it into the existing rail loadout system, and deposited it into the first covered hopper car positioned on the rail siding. When Tom's truck was empty, he closed the tailgate and drove back down the ramp. The entire loading operation from entry to exit took 6 minutes and 14 seconds. Tom pulled up beside Howard and climbed down from the cab. "That's the smoothest dump operation I've done all season. The ramp grade is perfect. The platform positioning is perfect. The pit alignment is perfect. You boys did professional grade work." "Thank you, Tom. Appreciate you being the first truck through." "Happy to be first. You just saved 184 farms from serious financial losses. That deserves to be acknowledged." A second truck pulled into the lot behind Tom, then a third, then a fourth. The word had spread through the farming community that the Roberts ramp was operational. Trucks were arriving from across 3 townships to dump their corn before Saturday's rain. By 9:47 p.m., 22 trucks had dumped through the temporary ramp. 22,000 bushels of corn loaded into the first 6 covered hopper cars on the rail siding. The operation was running smoothly. No equipment failures, no structural problems, no safety incidents. Margaret and the Roberts Volunteer Fire Department Auxiliary had set up the food service tent at 7 p.m. and were running coffee and sandwiches continuously. The October night was cool but not cold. Temperature in the mid-40s. Clear sky, stars visible. No sign yet of tomorrow's rain system. Claire arrived at 10:15 p.m. in her Honda Civic. She'd left Dylan with a neighbor. She walked across the gravel lot toward where Howard stood near the ramp structure, supervising truck operations. "Dad?" Howard turned. "Claire, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to see it, the ramp, the project that Garrett's been threatening to use against us." She looked at the structure rising against the night sky. Trucks rolling up and down, the steady rhythm of dump operations. "It's beautiful. It's functional. Beauty wasn't the goal. Dad, you built something that solved a real problem. Something that helps people. Something that works. That's beautiful." Claire paused. "Garrett called me 2 hours ago." "What did he say?" "He said he spent the afternoon documenting the state inspection. He said he has photos of Norris Fletcher examining the structure and issuing the certification. He said those photos prove that the project was conducted properly with appropriate oversight. She looked at her father. Then he said he's withdrawing the custody modification motion. He said after watching the project from start to finish, he realized his concerns were unfounded. He said he was wrong about you and wrong about the project. Howard stared at his daughter. Garrett admitted he was wrong. That's what he said. I asked him to confirm it in writing. He emailed me a letter 20 minutes ago stating that he's withdrawing the custody motion and that he acknowledges the Roberts Ramp project was conducted in accordance with professional standards. Why would he do that? Because Garrett's smart enough to recognize when he's on the wrong side of something that the entire community supports. Because continuing to attack this project would make him look vindictive and petty. Because backing down gracefully is better than losing a custody fight that was never really about Dylan's safety. Howard felt tension he had been carrying for 2 days released from his shoulders. So the threat is over. The threat is over. Garrett's withdrawing, Dylan stays with me, and I start my new job at the co-op on Monday. They stood together, watching the trucks roll through the ramp. Father and daughter, grandfather and mother. Two people who'd been through difficult times and had found a way to remain connected through it all. Dad, I want Dylan to learn from you. I want him to see what you built here. I want him to understand that when your community needs you, you show up. When the work is hard, you don't quit. When people doubt you, you prove them wrong through excellence. He's already learning that from watching you, Claire. You stood up to Garrett. You refused to let him control you through threats. You made hard choices and you stuck with them. Dylan's learning more from your example than he could ever learn from mine. Then he's learning from both of us. That's even better. The trucks continued loading through the night. Howard worked in 2-hour shifts supervising dump operations, checking the structure for any signs of stress or failure, monitoring the conveyor system for any operational issues. Earl rotated with him, taking alternate shifts. Calvin and Foster stayed through the night to provide equipment support if needed. Nash went home at midnight but returned at 4 a.m. with fresh coffee and breakfast sandwiches. By 5 a.m. Saturday morning, October 19, 2024, all 14 covered hopper rail cars on the Iroquois County Rail Line spur were loaded with 53,200 bushels of corn. The last truck finished dumping at 4:47 a.m. The Iroquois County freight train was scheduled to arrive at 7 a.m. to collect the loaded cars and transport them to the Decatur ADM terminal. Howard stood beside the empty ramp structure at 5:30 a.m., watching the eastern sky lighten. The structure had held through the night. 53 trucks, 53,200 bushels. Not a single failure here, not a loose board, not a shifted beam, not a safety incident. The engineering had held. The construction quality had held. The entire system had worked exactly as designed. Margaret arrived at 6 a.m. with Dylan. The boy was still sleepy, rubbing his eyes, wearing his pajamas under his winter coat. But he'd insisted on coming to see the ramp and watch the train pick up the loaded rail cars. Dylan ran across the gravel lot toward his grandfather. Grandpa Mom said all the trucks came through and nothing broke. Howard knelt down and put his arms around his grandson. That's right, buddy. Everything worked exactly like we planned. Can I go up the ramp now? Can I see the top? Howard looked at Margaret. She nodded. Howard took Dylan's hand and they walked up the ramp together. The climb took 2 minutes at Dylan's pace. At the top, the dump platform opened onto a view of the railroad siding and the 14 loaded hopper cars and the Robertstown buildings beyond. Grandpa, you built this in 3 days. Me and 6 other men built it together. Calvin and Landon and Nash and Foster and Vincent and Miles and Earl. When you work as a team, you can do things that seem impossible if you were trying to do them alone. Could I build something like this someday? Howard looked at his grandson. 7 years old, the age when boys start understanding that the world is bigger than their immediate surroundings. The age when they start imagining their place in that larger world. Dylan, you can build anything you set your mind to. But the important thing isn't what you build. It's why you build it. We built this ramp because our community needed it. Because farms all across this county were going to lose their harvest if we didn't. That's the kind of building that matters. Not just making something, but making something that helps people. The Iroquois County freight train arrived at 7:14 a.m., 14 minutes behind schedule. The locomotive was a Union Pacific ES-44 AC diesel-electric, pulling 37 empty hopper cars behind it. The train crew disconnected the empty cars on a side track and coupled the locomotive to the 14 loaded hopper cars that sat waiting on the main siding. At 7:31 a.m., the locomotive pulled the loaded cars out of the Roberts siding. The cars rolled slowly past the temporary ramp structure, past the collapsed grain bin, past the cluster of farmers and volunteers who'd gathered to watch the departure. The cars would travel south through Champaign and Decatur, arriving at the ADM terminal by late afternoon. The corn would be unloaded, weighed, graded, and sold into the commercial grain market. 53,200 bushels at $4.62 per bushel. Total value $245,784 distributed across the 53 farms whose trucks had dumped through the temporary ramp during the previous 12 hours. The rain arrived at 8:47 a.m. Saturday morning. Dark clouds rolled in from the southwest. The first drops fell at 8:51 a.m. By 9 a.m. it was raining steadily. By noon, 2.4 inches had fallen across Iroquois County. The rain continued through the afternoon and into the evening. By the time it stopped at 10:14 p.m. Saturday night, total accumulation measured 2.6 inches. But every bushel of corn was already on rails heading toward Decatur. None sat in wet piles on the ground. None spoiled in the rain. The temporary ramp had accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish, keeping the grain moving through the harvest window despite the elevator collapse. Sunday morning, October 20th, 2024. Howard woke at 7 a.m. to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. The rain had passed during the night. The day was clear and cool. He lay in bed for several minutes, not moving, assessing how his body felt. His chest was still tight. The tightness was unchanged from Thursday and Friday. It hadn't gotten worse despite 3 days of intensive physical activity and high stress. That was good. That meant he probably hadn't pushed his cardiac condition past the point of no return. But the tightness was still there, a reminder that his heart was damaged and that ignoring Dr. Holbrook's advice carried real consequences. His shoulders ached from the welding work he'd done on Thursday, despite promising Margaret he'd only supervise. His legs were sore from standing on concrete and gravel for extended periods. His lower back was tight from bending and reaching and working in awkward positions. He felt exactly like a 64-year-old man with a cardiac condition who just spent 3 days doing physical labor that his doctor had explicitly told him not to do. But he was alive, and the ramp was standing, and 184 farms had moved their corn to market. Margaret stood beside him. "How do you feel?" "Like I'm 64 years old and I just built a grain elevator ramp in 3 days." "Howard, that's not funny." "I'm not trying to be funny. I'm trying to say I feel exactly how I should feel after what we just did. Tired, sore, but alive." Margaret sat up and looked at him. "You scared me. For 3 days every time you came home, I didn't know if it was going to be the last time you came home healthy." "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't you?" said continue 0922. Claude responded, be sorry. Just don't do it again." "I can't promise I won't do it again. If another emergency comes up, if the community needs the Cross Brand Club, we'll respond. That's what the club exists for. Then next time you let someone else be the engineer of record. Let Earl do it. Let Vincent do it when he's healthy again. You supervise from a distance. You consult, you advise. But you don't spend 3 days on site doing the physical labor." "That's fair. I can agree to that." They lay in bed together, watching the sunlight move across the ceiling. The house was quiet. Claire and Dylan were still asleep. The day stretched ahead with no immediate demands, no urgent deadlines, no crisis requiring immediate response. At 9:23 a.m., Howard's cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Carl Hospital. His chest tightened immediately. Vincent. This had to be about Vincent. "Mr. Brennan, this is Dr. Sarah Winters from Carl Hospital. Oncology. I'm calling about Vincent Shaw. Mr. Shaw wanted me to contact you directly with an update on his condition." "How is he?" "Mr. Shaw was admitted Friday evening with severe lower back pain. We completed full imaging and blood work overnight. The cancer has not metastasized beyond the initial diagnosis site. That's good news. The pain he experienced was severe muscle strain in the lumbar region, likely caused by physical exertion, compounded by the effects of hormone therapy on muscle tissue and bone density. Is the muscle strain serious? It's painful but not permanently damaging. We're keeping him for observation through today. He should be discharged tomorrow with pain management medication and strict instructions to avoid heavy physical activity for the next 3 weeks. His prognosis for the cancer remains stable. The radiation therapy scheduled for November should proceed as planned. Thank God. Mr. Shaw also asked me to give you a specific message. He said, and I'm quoting here, "Tell Howard I'll be back for the next cross-brand club emergency as soon as the doctor clears me for work." Howard smiled. "Tell Vincent I'm holding him to that. Tell him the club will be ready when he's healthy." At 10:47 a.m., Cassidy Porter called Howard's cell phone. "Howard, the co-op board met at 8 this morning. We need to talk about the ramp and about compensation for the cross-brand club." "What about the ramp?" "The board voted to lease the temporary ramp from the cross-brand club for $4,200 per month from October 2024 through June 2025. The permanent replacement bin won't be completed until next summer. We need the ramp operational through the entire fall and spring marketing season." Howard was quiet doing the math. 9 months at $4,200 per month was $37,800. Materials cost was $24,820. Net profit to the club would be $12,980. "Cassidy, that's very generous. The club wasn't expecting ongoing compensation. We did this as an emergency response." "I know you did, but the board recognizes that you built something with significant long-term value. The lease payment reflects that value. You saved this county hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential crop losses and storage fees. $4,200 a month is more than fair. When would the lease start?" "It started Friday evening when the first truck dumped through the ramp, so you've already accrued 2 days of lease payments. The first check will be cut on Monday for the full October payment of $4,200. The club appreciates that, Cassidy. We'll put the revenue back into the emergency fund to cover future projects. There's one more thing. The board wants to formally thank the Cross Brand Club. We're planning a recognition dinner next month. The whole community, everyone who contributed to making the emergency response work. Will you and the other members attend? I'll talk to Earl. I'm sure we'll be there." At 2 p.m. Sunday afternoon, Earl Tucker drove out to the Roberts loadout in his silver Chevy Silverado 2500 with Ruth in the passenger seat. The rain had stopped. The temporary drive-over ramp sat against the rail spur oak decking, still dark with moisture, steel I-beams, showing the beginning of surface oxidation that would need treatment before winter. Howard met Earl in the gravel lot. "Earl, Howard, Ruth wanted to see the ramp." Ruth climbed out of the truck. She was 63 years old, retired school teacher, married to Earl for 41 years. She taught 3rd grade at Roberts Elementary for 34 years before retiring in 2021. She taught Claire. She was currently teaching Dylan. She knew 3 generations of Iroquois County families. Ruth walked toward the ramp structure and stood looking at it for a long moment. The structure rose 84 feet from ground level to the dump platform. Steel and oak, functional and solid, built by 7 men in 3 days to save 184 farms from financial disaster. "Earl told me what you built here. I didn't believe it was possible until I saw it with my own eyes. It was 7 men working together, Ruth, not just me. 7 men led by you." Ruth turned to face Howard. "Earl also told me what you said about Marcus, that Marcus would be proud of what the Cross Brand Club has become. Marcus understood what this kind of work meant, why it mattered. He believed farming was about more than individual operations. It was about community and mutual support." Ruth's eyes were damp. "Marcus was 28 when he died. Sometimes I think about all the things he didn't get to do, didn't get to have children, didn't get to see his parents grow old, didn't get to build the kind of life he was planning." She paused. "But then I see something like this ramp, and I realize Marcus's beliefs didn't die with him. They're alive in the Cross Brand Club, in the work you and Earl and the others do. Marcus's legacy isn't what he built himself. It's what he inspired other people to build." That's a good way to think about it, Ruth. Thank you for saying what you said to Earl about Marcus being proud. That meant something to both of us. Earl and Howard walked to the base of the ramp and stood looking up at the structure. The afternoon sun broke through the residual clouds, illuminating the wet oak decking. Howard, what happens now? Cassidy's leasing the ramp through June, $4,200 a month. The club nets almost $13,000 in profit after materials costs. That's substantial revenue. It's more than revenue, Earl. It's validation that what we built has genuine value, that the cross-brand club can do professional-grade work that sustains itself financially while serving community needs. Earl was quiet for a moment. Norris Fletcher said the state's filing this as a precedent build. He said other counties will reference it when they face similar emergencies, which means the next time an elevator collapses somewhere, they might call us. The Cross Brand Club just became a regional emergency response resource, not just a local mutual aid organization. You realize what that means. We're not just helping our neighbors anymore. We're setting standards, creating models, teaching other communities how to solve their own infrastructure problems. That was always Marcus's vision, wasn't it? That farmers with skills and resources have a responsibility to use those assets for more than just individual profit. That we should be strengthening the agricultural community as a whole. That's exactly what Marcus believed. He'd be proud of what we accomplished here. They stood in silence for a moment, watching a few lingering trucks roll past on Route 49. The harvest was nearly complete across Iroquois County. Most farms were wrapping up their operations for the season. The temporary ramp would see less traffic over the next few weeks, then pick up again in the spring when stored grain started moving to market. Earl, I got a call from the USDA this morning. What did they want? They're designating the Roberts Ramp as a case study in emergency agricultural infrastructure response. They're publishing documentation as a best practice model for rural communities. And they want the Cross Brand Club to present the project at the National Grain Elevator Convention in Kansas City next March. Earl looked at Howard. The National Grain Elevator Convention. That's industry professionals, state officials, USDA administrators. That's what it is. And they want us to present our methods and our results and our lessons learned. They want other communities to understand how 7 farmers with equipment and determination solved a problem that a licensed contractor quoted 6 weeks and $148,000 to complete. Are you going to accept? I think we should. I think the other 6 men should have a say in the decision, but my recommendation is that we accept. Because this is bigger than just building a ramp in Roberts. This is about demonstrating what's possible when rural communities take ownership of their own infrastructure challenges instead of waiting for government programs or corporate contractors. Earl nodded slowly. I agree. We should present. This is about showing other people what they can accomplish if they organize and commit. Monday morning, October 21st, 2024. Howard was in the machine shed working on routine equipment maintenance when his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a 202 area code. Washington, D.C. This is Howard Brennan. Mr. Brennan, this is Kelsey Morrison from the United States Department of Agriculture Agricultural Marketing Service. I'm calling regarding the emergency grain loadout structure your team constructed in Roberts, Illinois. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Brennan, we've received the inspection documentation from Illinois Department of Agriculture, Inspector Norris Fletcher. We've also reviewed the construction timeline, the materials, specifications, the safety protocols, and the operational results. The USDA is designating your project as a national case study in emergency agricultural infrastructure response. We appreciate that recognition. The designation means we'll be publishing your documentation as a best practice models for rural communities facing grain handling emergencies. The materials will be distributed to state agricultural departments, cooperative extension services, and grain handling operations across the country. We expect significant interest from other counties that have aging infrastructure and limited emergency response capabilities. That's good to hear. Additionally, we'd like to invite you and the Cross Brand Club members to present your project at the National Grain Elevator Convention in Kansas City, Missouri in March 2025. The convention draws approximately 1,500 attendees from across the grain handling industry. Your presentation would be a keynote session focusing on emergency response methods and community-based infrastructure solutions. Howard was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what was being offered. The National Grain Elevator Convention was the premier professional gathering for the grain handling industry. Presenting there meant speaking to an audience of industry experts, equipment manufacturers, state regulators, and agricultural business leaders. It meant the cross-brand club's work would reach far beyond Iroquois County. Ma'am, I'll need to discuss this with the other club members, but I believe we'd be honored to present. Excellent. I'll send formal invitation materials to your email address, along with presentation guidelines and logistical information. Thank you for your innovative work, Mr. Brennan. Projects like yours demonstrate what's possible when communities take ownership of their challenges. Howard ended the call and stood in the machine shed looking at his phone. Then he called Earl. Earl, the USDA just called. What did they want? They want us to present at the National Grain Elevator Convention in Kansas City next March. They're designating the Roberts Ramp as a national case study. They're publishing our documentation as a best practice model for other communities. Earl was silent for several seconds. Howard, we just went from 7 farmers helping each other to being a national model for emergency infrastructure response. That's what it looks like. What did you tell them? I said I'd discuss it with the club members. What do you think? I think we accept. I think we present. Because this is about more than us. This is about showing other rural communities that they have the capability to solve their own problems, that they don't need to wait for government programs or expensive contractors, that they can organize locally and accomplish things that seem impossible. I agree. I'll email the other 5 members tonight. We'll get consensus. But I think everyone's going to want to do this. Tuesday morning, October 22nd, 2024. Howard was cleaning welding equipment in the machine shed when a white GMC Yukon pulled into the farmstead driveway. Garrett Voss climbed out. He wore jeans and a casual shirt instead of his usual contractor work clothes. He walked toward the machine shed with something between hesitation and determination in his posture. Howard set down the wire brush he was using and pulled off his work gloves. Garrett. Howard, I came to say something. Can I have a few minutes? I'm listening. Garrett pulled a manila folder from under his arm and handed it to Howard. This is everything I compiled over the past 4 days. Photos of the construction process, documentation of the timeline, notes from conversations with people in town who were watching the project. I built this file because I was convinced your ramp was going to fail, and I wanted evidence to use in custody litigation. Howard took the folder but didn't open it. The ramp didn't fail, Garrett continued. It passed state inspection on the first try. It operated safely for 12 hours without incident. 53,000 bushels moved through it. You did exactly what you said you'd do. He paused. I was wrong. I let my ego turn a business loss into something personal. I used your project as a weapon against Claire. I threatened custody modifications to try to force you to abandon the work. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. Why are you giving this to me? Because you deserve to have it. Because you should know what I was planning to do with it. And because I want you to see that I'm backing down voluntarily, not because I'm afraid of losing a custody fight. Garrett extended his hand. I'm withdrawing the custody motion. I'm acknowledging in writing that the Roberts Ramp project was conducted properly. I'm apologizing to you and to Claire for using Dylan as leverage. I'm sorry, Howard. Howard looked at Garrett's extended hand. The man who'd made Claire's life difficult for 5 years. The man who'd threatened his daughter and grandson to try to undermine the ramp project. The man who was now standing in Howard's machine shed apologizing. Howard shook Garrett's hand. Apology accepted. One more thing. I'm recommending Voss Construction's clients to consider you for future emergency projects. I'm telling them that if they face infrastructure failures, the Cross-Brand Club can respond faster and more effectively than traditional contractors. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do and because your work deserves recognition. I appreciate that, Garrett. Garrett walked back to the Yukon and drove away. Howard stood holding the manila folder. Inside were printed photos of the construction process, timeline documentation, witness statements, everything Garrett had compiled to use as evidence that the project was reckless and dangerous. Howard walked into the house and handed the folder to Margaret. Garrett came by. What did he want? To apologize, to withdraw the custody threat, to acknowledge he was wrong. Margaret opened the folder and looked through the contents. Photos of the foundation work, photos of the I-beam installation, photos of the state inspection. He documented everything. He was building a case to use against us. Then he realized the case had no foundation because we did the work properly. Sometimes people surprise you. Sometimes they do. Wednesday morning, October 23rd, 2024. Nash Aldridge pulled into the Brennan farmstead at 7 a.m. in his silver GMC Sierra. Howard was loading firewood onto a trailer for winter. Nash climbed out of the truck and walked over. "Howard, you got a minute?" "Sure, Nash. What's on your mind?" Nash looked at the ground, then at Howard. This was difficult for him. Howard could see it in the tension around his eyes, the way he was holding his shoulders. "The boundary dispute, the survey, the 5 acres, you were right. The survey was accurate. The land was yours. I knew that the day the report was filed." Nash paused. "I blamed you for my son having to leave school. Treated you like you'd done something wrong when all you did was verify your property boundaries. I've been carrying that anger for 16 months. Nash, I never intended for your son to have to leave Illinois State. I know that now. I also know something I didn't know until yesterday." Nash pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "This was in my mailbox Monday afternoon. It's a cashier's check for $8,000. There's a note with it from Margaret." Howard looked at the envelope. "The note says Margaret arranged a private loan last year to help cover my son's tuition after he had to withdraw. Says the loan's been fully repaid and this is the final payment with interest." Nash's voice was thick. "Howard, your wife loaned me $8,000 to keep my son in school. She did it without telling you, without anyone knowing, while I was treating you like an enemy. I didn't know about the loan until you just told me. That makes it worse somehow, that Margaret saw my family struggling and helped us without expecting recognition or gratitude, while I was refusing to speak to you for 16 months over a property boundary that was legally correct." Nash extended his hand. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong to carry anger this long. You're good people, Howard. Your family's good people. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." Howard shook Nash's hand. "We're past it now, Nash. Let's move forward. One more thing. My son enrolled at Parkland Community College last month. He's taking agriculture business courses. The plan is to transfer back to Illinois State next fall. He's going to finish his degree, and that's happening because Margaret helped us when we needed it most. Tell your son congratulations. Community college is a smart path. He'll come out with less debt and the same degree." Nash nodded and walked back to his truck. Howard watched him drive away, then walked into the house. Margaret was in the kitchen, working on household bookkeeping. "Nash just left," Howard said. Margaret looked up from her ledger. "What did he want?" "To tell me you loaned his family $8,000 last year for his son's tuition. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew you'd say yes if I asked, so I just did it. The boy needed help. We had the cash available. It seemed like the right thing to do." "Margaret, $8,000 is a significant amount of money. We should have discussed it." "I know, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you at the time. But watching that boy drop out of school because of a property boundary dispute that was technically correct but humanly painful, I couldn't just stand by." She set down her pen. "Sometimes the right thing to do is obvious, and you just need to do it without overthinking." Howard sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "You're a better person than I am." "That's not true. You spend 3 days building a ramp to save 184 farms. You put your health at risk to help your community. We're both doing our best to help where we can. I love you. I love you too. Now go finish loading that firewood. Winter's coming and we need to be ready." Friday afternoon, October 25th, 2024. Howard was in the machine shed teaching Dylan basic tool identification. The boy was 7 years old, too young for welding equipment or power tools, but not too young to learn the names and purposes of hand tools. "This is a ratchet," Howard said, holding up the tool. "It lets you tighten and loosen bolts without removing the socket after every turn. You click this lever here to change direction." Dylan took the ratchet and examined it carefully, turning it over in his small hands. "Can I try it?" "Not yet. First you learn what it is and how it works. Then you watch me use it on real projects. Then after you've watched maybe 20 times, you get to try it yourself with supervision. Tools are dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, but they're incredibly useful if you learn properly. When will I be old enough to weld like you? Welding's probably 8 or 9 years away. You need to be strong enough to handle the equipment safely. You need to understand the chemistry of how metal melts and fuses. You need to respect how dangerous it is if you make mistakes." Howard paused. But I can start teaching you the theory now. How different metals respond to heat. What makes a good weld versus a poor weld? Why some joints are stronger than others. Dylan set the ratchet down carefully on the workbench. Grandpa, when you built the ramp, did you know it was going to work? Howard thought about the question. How do you explain an uncertainty and calculated risk to a 7-year-old? How do you convey that sometimes you have to act without guarantees? I knew the math was right. I knew the engineering was sound based on the calculations I did. But I didn't know if we could build it fast enough. I didn't know if the weather would cooperate. I didn't know if something unexpected would go wrong. So no, I didn't know for certain it would work. I just knew we had to try. Were you scared? Yes, I was scared I'd have a heart problem and have to stop before we finished. I was scared one of the other men would get hurt. I was scared the structure would fail state inspection and we'd have wasted 3 days of work. Fear is normal when you're doing something important and difficult. What did you do when you were scared? I kept working. I focused on the next task, the next measurement, the next weld, the next decision. You can't think about the whole project when you're scared because it's too overwhelming. You just think about the next small thing you need to do, and you do it, and then you think about the next small thing after that. Eventually you look up and realize you've completed something big by doing a lot of small things properly. Dylan nodded slowly, processing the information the way children do when they're trying to fit new concepts into their understanding of how the world works. I get scared sometimes at school when we have tests. What do you do when that happens? Mom says to answer one question at a time. Don't think about all the questions. Just answer the one in front of me, then move to the next one. That's exactly right. Your mom's teaching you the same lesson. Big, scary things become manageable when you break them into small pieces. Claire appeared at the machine shed door. Dylan, time to wash up for dinner. Dylan ran toward his mother. Claire watched him go, then looked at Howard. Thanks for spending time with him, Dad. He looks up to you. He's a good kid. You're raising him well. We're raising him well. You and Mom and me together. She paused. I got some news today. I passed the probation period at the co-op. Cassidy's making my position permanent. Full benefits starting December 1st. Howard felt relief wash through him. That's excellent news, Claire. Cassidy also told me I'm getting a raise. The board approved an increase to $52,000 annual salary. That's enough that I can start looking at renting my own place. Maybe by spring, Dylan and I can move into our own house. You don't have to rush out of here. This is your home as long as you need it. I know, and I'm grateful, but Dylan and I need our own space. We need to rebuild our independence. Moving in here after the divorce was necessary. Moving out when we're ready is also necessary. I understand. Just know the door is always open if you need to come back. Thanks, Dad. Sunday morning, November 3rd, 2024. The Roberts Community Center was packed with approximately 250 people for the Cross-Brand Club recognition dinner. The co-op board had organized the event to formally acknowledge the 7 men who'd built the temporary ramp. Long tables filled the main hall covered with white tablecloths and centerpieces made from autumn leaves and dried corn stalks. The smell of roast beef and mashed potatoes and fresh-baked rolls drifted from the kitchen. Howard sat at the head table with Margaret beside him. Earl and Ruth sat to his left. Calvin, Landon, Nash, Foster, Vincent, and Miles sat with their families at the same table. Vincent was moving easier now, 3 weeks past the muscle strain incident. The doctors had given him medical clearance to attend the dinner, but with strict instructions to avoid any physical exertion for another 2 weeks. Cassidy Porter stood at a podium near the front of the room. The crowd quieted as she began to speak. Thank you all for coming tonight. We're here to recognize 7 men who showed this community what's possible when people choose to act instead of waiting for permission or outside help. On October 16th, the Iroquois County Cooperative Grain Elevator collapsed. 184 farms lost their primary loadout facility. The nearest alternative was 32 miles away. The next rain was 3 days out. We faced a crisis that threatened the economic stability of this entire county. Cassidy paused and looked at the head table. Howard Brennan, Randall Tucker, Calvin Merrick, Landon, Whitmore Nash, Aldridge, Foster Bryant, Vincent Shaw, and Miles Hartley. These 7 men built an 84-foot drive-over ramp in 32 hours. They did it with volunteer labor, donated equipment, and materials purchased from the Cross-Brand Club Emergency Fund. They did it to a quality standard that passed Illinois state inspection on the first try and has been designated by the USDA as a national best practice model for emergency agricultural infrastructure. The room erupted in applause. Howard felt his face flush. Beside him, Margaret squeezed his hand. Across the table, Earl sat with his eyes closed, absorbing the recognition. The temporary ramp saved this county an estimated $480,000 in potential crop losses. It processed 53,000 bushels on the first night of operation. It's currently handling approximately 2,000 bushels per day through the fall marketing season. It will remain operational through June 2025 while we construct a permanent replacement bin. Cassidy held up a wooden plaque with brass engraving. On behalf of the Iroquois County Cooperative and the 184 farms served by this facility, I present this recognition award to the Cross Brand Club. Earl stood and walked to the podium to accept the plaque. He looked at it for a long moment, running his fingers over the engraving. Then he turned to face the room. My son Marcus died 8 years ago in a farm equipment accident. He was 28 years old. Earl's voice was steady but quiet. The room was completely silent. In the months after we lost Marcus, I struggled to find meaning. I struggled to understand why I was still here and he wasn't. I struggled to figure out what I was supposed to do with the grief that felt like it was going to break me apart. Earl looked at the 6 other men at the head table. The Cross Brand Club was formed 3 years after Marcus died. It was my way of honoring what he believed about farming and community and the responsibility we have to show up for each other. Marcus always said farming was about more than personal profit. It was about being part of something larger than yourself, about using your skills and resources to strengthen the community around you. He held the plaque against his chest. What we built at the Roberts Loadout wasn't just a ramp. It was proof that Marcus was right, that when people organize and commit and work together, they can solve problems that seem impossible. This award belongs to everyone in this room. Every farmer who brought a truck through the ramp, every family that served food and coffee, every person who believed we could do something that professional contractors said would take 6 weeks. The applause lasted more than 2 minutes. People stood. Some were crying. The recognition wasn't just for the ramp. It was for a community that had come together during a crisis and had demonstrated what rural America was capable of when people chose action over resignation. After dinner, Howard stood outside the community center in the cool November night. Dylan ran across the parking lot with 3 other kids from his school, playing some game involving running and shouting, and the kind of pure physical joy that only young children seem capable of accessing. Claire stood with a group of women near the entrance, laughing about something one of them had said. Margaret talked with Ruth and Elena Shaw near their cars, the 3 women who'd supported their husbands through the 3-day emergency build and who'd run the food service operation that kept everyone fed and functional. Vincent Shaw walked over and stood beside Howard. He moved easier now without the careful deliberation that pain had required. Howard, I wanted to thank you again for what you said at the hospital about my contribution to the project. I meant every word, Vincent. Your steel sourcing made the build financially possible. I'm starting radiation treatment next week, 8 weeks of daily sessions. The oncologist says the prognosis is good, 85% 5-year survival rate with this treatment protocol. Vincent paused. When I'm through this, when I'm healthy again, I want to be ready for the next Cross Brand Club emergency. We'll be ready for you, Vincent. Take care of yourself first. The club will be here. Earl walked over to join them. Howard, Vincent, beautiful night. The 3 men stood in comfortable silence watching the parking lot activity. Families loading into cars, kids playing, the community center lights warm against the November darkness. Earl, you think we'll get called for other emergencies? Vincent asked. Now that we're a USDA case study, I think we will. And when we do, we'll show up the same way we showed up for Roberts. We'll assess the situation, we'll determine what's needed, we'll organize resources, we'll do the work. Earl looked at Howard and Vincent. That's what the Cross Brand Club is. 7 men who know how to solve problems. 7 men who understand that community means taking care of each other when things get hard. Marcus would be proud, Vincent said quietly. Earl was quiet for a moment. Marcus is proud. I feel it every time we take on a project like this. He's proud of what we've built in his name. They stood together watching Dylan and the other kids run across the parking lot in the kind of chaotic patterns that only make sense to 7-year-olds. The future generation, the ones who would inherit whatever the current generation built or failed to build. That's why we do this, Howard said, not just for the farms that need help right now, but for those kids. So they grow up in communities that know how to take care of themselves. So they learn that when something breaks, you don't wait for someone else to fix it. You figure out how to fix it yourself. Monday morning, November 18th, 2024. Howard opened his email to find a message from the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. The subject line read, National Grain Elevator Convention. Presentation, details, and travel information. The email contained detailed information about the March 2025 convention in Kansas City. Presentation guidelines, hotel accommodations, travel reimbursement procedures, a request for preliminary outline materials to be submitted by January 15th. Howard read through the email twice, then printed it and drove to Earl's farm. Earl was in his workshop replacing bearings on a grain auger when Howard arrived. Howard handed him the printed email. Kansas City, March 20th through 22nd. We're presenting on Friday the 21st at 2 p.m. keynote session. Expected audience of approximately 600 attendees from the grain handling industry. Earl read the email, then set it on his workbench. 600 people, that's a significant audience. The USDA wants us to present our methods and our results. They want us to explain how 7 farmers built critical infrastructure in 3 days using volunteer labor and donated equipment. They want other communities to understand what's possible. What do we need to do between now and March? We need to create presentation materials by January 15th. That's less than 2 months. We need to coordinate with all 7 members, get everyone's input on what worked and what we do differently, document lessons learned, create visual aids that explain our process clearly. Earl nodded. Vincent will be through radiation treatment by then. He can participate in the planning. The presentation is about more than us, Earl. It's about demonstrating a model. It's about showing other rural communities that they have the capability to solve their own infrastructure problems, that they don't need to wait for government programs or corporate contractors, that they can organize locally and accomplish things that seem impossible. That's what Marcus always wanted, for farmers to take control of their situations instead of being passive recipients of whatever solutions other people designed for them. Then we're carrying that vision forward. The Roberts Ramp is the proof of concept. The Kansas City presentation is how we teach other people to replicate what we did. Wednesday, December 11th, 2024. Howard stood in the Roberts loadout gravel lot watching grain trucks move through the temporary ramp. 2 months since the build. The structure was holding up well through regular use. The oak decking showed wear patterns where trucks drove most frequently, but the boards remained solid. The steel I-beams had been treated with rust inhibitor and repainted in November. The ramp was processing approximately 1,000 bushels per day through the late fall marketing period. Cassidy Porter walked over to where Howard stood. Howard, I wanted to update you on the permanent bin construction schedule. We've contracted with a builder out of Bloomington. They're starting foundation work in March. The new bin will be operational by mid-July. Larger capacity than the old bin. Improved structural design with better safety margins. Updated conveyor systems. That's good progress. The temporary ramp will stay in service through June. After the new bin opens in July, the ramp reverts to cross-brand club ownership per our lease agreement. What are you planning to do with it? Howard looked at the ramp structure. 84 feet of steel and oak that had saved 184 farms from financial disaster. We're going to dismantle it carefully. Store the components. Keep the I-beams and the oak decking in the conveyor system ready for rapid deployment. Because there will be another emergency somewhere, and when it happens, we'll have materials staged and ready to transport. You're building an emergency response inventory. Exactly. The Roberts build taught us what we need. Now we're maintaining those resources so the next response is faster and more efficient. We're becoming a legitimate emergency infrastructure resource for agricultural communities. Cassidy looked at the ramp. Howard, what you built here goes beyond physical infrastructure. You built a model for how communities can take care of themselves, how neighbors can solve problems together without waiting for outside assistance. That model has value that extends far beyond this one ramp. That's the goal, to show people what's possible when they organize and commit. Friday evening, January 10th, 2025. Howard sat at the kitchen table with Dylan helping the boy with a school project, second grade social studies. The assignment was to write about someone in the community who helps people. Dylan had chosen to write about his grandfather in the grain elevator ramp. "Grandpa, how do you spell engineering?" Howard spelled it out letter by letter. Dylan wrote carefully in his second grade handwriting, tongue between his teeth, in concentration. "What else should I write about the ramp? Explain why it mattered. Tell them that farms needed a place to take their corn, and the ramp solved that problem. Explain that 7 men worked together to build it in 3 days. Explain that when communities face problems, sometimes the solution comes from local people using their skills and resources to help each other." Dylan wrote for several minutes periodically asking Howard how to spell difficult words. Finally, he looked up. "Grandpa, when I grow up, can I be in the Cross Brand Club?" Howard felt something catch in his throat. The Cross Brand Club accepts new members when existing members retire or when we expand to include new specializations. If you develop skills the club needs, and if you demonstrate the values we care about, then yes, you could join eventually. What skills should I learn? That depends on what interests you. Some people are good with heavy equipment. Some people are good with fabrication and welding. Some people are good with engineering and design. Some people are good with logistics and planning. The club works because each person brings different expertise. Howard paused. But skills are just tools. What really matters is character. Being someone people can depend on. Being someone who shows up when things are difficult. Being someone who puts community needs ahead of personal convenience. "I can be dependable, Grandpa." "I know you can. I see it in you already." Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Dylan, bedtime in 15 minutes. Finish your homework." Dylan groaned but kept writing. Claire walked over and read what he'd written. She looked at Howard with damp eyes. "This is beautiful, Dad. His teacher's going to love it. He's expressing himself well for a second grader. He's expressing it himself like someone who's been listening carefully to his grandfather. Learning what matters. Understanding that actions have meaning beyond immediate results." After Dylan went to bed, Howard sat with Margaret in the living room. The January night was cold and clear outside. The house was quiet. The day's work was finished. Dylan asked if he could join the Cross Brand Club when he grows up, Howard said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him membership depends on developing skills and demonstrating character. But I also told him I saw those qualities in him already." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That boy worships you, Howard. Everything you do, he watches. Everything you say, he remembers. You're teaching him what it means to be someone who contributes meaningfully to his community." "I'm just showing him what my father showed me, what Earl's showing through the Cross Brand Club. That the work matters, that helping others matters, that showing up when you're needed matters. You built more than a ramp. You built something Dylan will carry with him for the rest of his life, an understanding that he's part of something larger than himself, that he has a responsibility to use his capabilities to strengthen his community." Saturday, March 15th, 2025. The Kansas City Convention Center Ballroom held approximately 600 people. The National Grain Elevator Convention was in its second day. Howard stood backstage with the other 6 Cross Brand Club members waiting to present their case study on the Roberts Emergency Loadout build. Earl wore a navy suit and tie, looking more formal than Howard had ever seen him. Calvin wore pressed khakis and a sport coat. Landon wore his Marine Corps dress blues with full decorations. Nash wore a dark suit with a bolo tie. Foster wore a gray suit and carried the leather portfolio containing presentation materials. Vincent wore a black suit looking healthy and strong after completing radiation treatment in December. Miles wore wire-rimmed glasses and a brown suit with a green tie. A official came backstage. "Gentlemen, you're on in 5 minutes. The crowd's been waiting for your presentation since the schedule was announced. Yours is the keynote case study everyone wants to hear." Howard looked at the other 6 men. "Everyone ready?" 6 nods. They'd spent the past 2 months preparing this presentation, creating slides, rehearsing content, coordinating who would speak about which aspects of the project. They'd practiced twice with Ruth and Margaret and the wives of the other men as a test audience. They were ready. They walked onto the stage together. The ballroom audience applauded. Howard stepped to the podium and pulled up the first presentation slide projected on the massive screen behind him. A photo of the collapsed grain bin at Roberts. The image showed the massive pile of spilled corn and the leaning concrete stave wall that had failed under the pressure of wet corn. On October 16, 2024, the Iroquois County Cooperative Grain Elevator at Roberts, Illinois, experienced catastrophic structural failure. 184 farms lost their primary loadout facility. The nearest alternative elevator was 32 miles away and operating at capacity. The next rain system was forecast to arrive in 72 hours. We faced an emergency that threatened significant crop losses across 3 townships. Howard advanced to the next slide, a technical drawing of the temporary ramp design showing steel I-beams, oak decking, gravity pit, and conveyor integration. 7 men with 7 different specializations recognized that pooling resources and working collaboratively could solve a problem that was impossible for individual operators. We designed and built an 84-foot drive-over ramp in 32 hours using volunteer labor and donated equipment at a total cost of $24,820 in materials. The presentation continued for 47 minutes. Howard covered the engineering specifications and design calculations. Earl discussed the cross-brand club organizational structure and the 11-year history of mutual aid that had built trust among the members. Calvin explained equipment requirements and the critical importance of precision operation. Landon talked about materials handling techniques and the quarter-inch tolerance requirements for I-beam placement. Nash covered timber selection and decking installation methods. Foster demonstrated welding standards through photos and video clips showing actual weld quality. Vincent explained materials sourcing and the importance of supplier relationships in obtaining components on emergency timelines. Miles described gravity pit engineering and conveyor system integration. When they finished, the ballroom was silent for several seconds. Then someone in the third row started clapping. The applause spread. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. The ovation lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds. People weren't just applauding the technical accomplishment. They were applauding what it represented, a demonstration that rural communities had the capability to solve their own infrastructure challenges without waiting for external intervention. The USDA official who'd introduced them returned to the stage. "Gentlemen, we have 30 minutes for questions." Hands went up across the ballroom. Howard called on a woman in the second row wearing an Iowa Department of Agriculture shirt. "How did you manage liability concerns with volunteer labor on an emergency construction project?" Howard explained the insurance structure, the emergency permit process, and the state inspection protocols that provided regulatory oversight. A man in the fifth row raised his hand. "What would you do differently if you had to build the ramp again?" Earl fielded that question. "We'd maintain a staged inventory of critical materials. Now that we've completed one successful build, we know exactly what components are needed. If we get called to another emergency, we can transport pre-staged materials immediately instead of spending time sourcing and coordinating deliveries." A man near the back stood. "What's your advice for other rural communities that might face similar infrastructure emergencies?" Howard stepped back to the podium. "Build relationships before you need them. The Cross Brand Club existed for 11 years before we took on the Roberts Project. We knew each other's capabilities. We knew each other's equipment. We knew we could work together under pressure because we'd done it many times before on smaller projects. That foundation of trust and proven collaboration is what made the emergency response possible." The questions continued for the full 30 minutes. When the session ended, approximately 90 people came forward to speak with the 7 club members. Cooperative managers from Iowa and Nebraska and Kansas and Wisconsin, state agricultural officials from Missouri and Minnesota and Indiana, USDA administrators, university extension agents, equipment manufacturers interested in understanding what tools and materials work best for emergency builds. A man in a Wisconsin Department of Agriculture shirt handed Howard his business card. "We have 18 grain elevators in our district operating with structural concerns. At least 3 of them could fail in the next 2 years. Can the Cross Brand Club provide consulting services? Help us develop our own emergency response protocols." Howard looked at Earl. Earl nodded. "Send us details about your situations. We'll review and provide recommendations. We can help you identify which communities have the resources and skills to form their own mutual aid organizations. We can help you understand what equipment and materials you need to stage. We can help you develop training programs for local volunteers. By the time they left the convention center, the Cross Brand Club had collected 63 business cards and 24 formal consulting inquiries from 7 different states. On the flight back to Illinois, Earl leaned across the aisle toward Howard. We just became a regional consulting operation, and you understand that. I understand we have an opportunity to help other communities develop their own capabilities, to teach them how to organize locally and solve their own problems instead of depending entirely on corporate contractors or government programs. This is bigger than farming now. This is about rural communities learning self-sufficiency, learning that they have the expertise and resources to handle infrastructure challenges if they organize properly. That's exactly what it should be. Marcus's vision extended beyond just Iroquois County. He believed in strengthening rural communities generally. We're carrying that vision to a regional scale. Sunday, April 20th, 2025. The Roberts temporary ramp was entering its final months of operation. The new permanent grain bin was nearing completion. Large concrete structures rose beside the rail spur. Cassidy estimated the bin would be operational by late June. The temporary ramp would be dismantled in July. Howard stood at the base of the ramp with Dylan. The buddy was 8 years old now, taller than he'd been 6 months ago, confident in ways he hadn't been when he and Claire first moved into the farmhouse after the divorce. "Grandpa, where will the ramp go after they take it down?" "We're storing the components at Earl's farm. The I-beams go in his equipment barn. The oak decking gets stacked in covered storage. The conveyor system goes back to Miles's shop. Everything stays organized and ready for rapid deployment." "When will you need it again?" "We don't know. Could be next year, could be 5 years, could be never if we're lucky and no other elevators collapse. But having the materials staged means we can respond quickly when emergencies happen." Dylan looked at the ramp structure. 84 feet of weathered oak and painted steel. "Will there be another emergency?" "Eventually, yes. Infrastructure fails, equipment breaks, disasters happen. That's part of life. What matters is how communities respond, whether people come together to solve problems or whether they wait passively for someone else to fix things. The Cross Brand Club comes together. That's right, we assess situations, we determine what's needed, we organize resources, we do the work. We don't wait for permission or external solutions. We take ownership of problems in our community. Dylan was quiet for a moment, studying the ramp with the kind of serious expression that suggested he was thinking about something important. "Grandpa, I want to learn welding. Real welding, not just theory. Can you teach me?" Howard looked at his grandson, 8 years old, still young but old enough to start understanding that skills require years of patient development. "Welding is dangerous if you don't approach it properly. But yes, I can teach you. We'll start with safety training, learning about heat in metal and the ways things can go wrong. Then we'll move to theory, understanding metallurgy and joint design and load calculations. Then we'll practice on scrap metal under supervision. By the time you're 12 or 13, you'll be ready to work on actual projects. That's 5 more years. 5 years of building foundational skills properly." Calvin didn't become an equipment expert overnight. Foster didn't become a master welder in a few months. Vincent didn't learn steel fabrication in a year. These capabilities take time to develop. But if you're willing to invest that time, I'll teach you everything I know. "I'll invest the time, Grandpa, I promise." They stood together at the base of the ramp, grandfather and grandson, looking at the structure that had saved 184 farms and had become a national model for emergency agricultural infrastructure response. The April sun was warm on their faces. The spring breeze carried the smell of fresh-turned earth from nearby fields, where farmers were preparing for planting season. "Grandpa." "Yes, Dylan." "When I'm old enough to join the Cross Brand Club, I want to be just like you. I want to build things that help people." Howard felt his throat tighten. He put his hand on Dylan's shoulder. "You're already on that path. You're already learning what matters. Keep learning, keep growing, keep caring about your community. That's what makes someone worth knowing. Not just the skills, but the character that determines how you use those skills." They walked back to the truck together. Behind them, the temporary ramp stood against the April sky, a structure that would be dismantled in 3 months, but would remain in the community's memory as proof of what 7 men could accomplish when they chose to show up for each other when it mattered most. The line gets held by the people who show up. That was the lesson. That was what Howard Brennan and the Cross Brand Club had demonstrated. That was what Dylan would carry forward into whatever future he built for himself. Sometimes the most important structures aren't the ones made from steel and oak. Sometimes the most important structures are the relationships and the commitments in the shared understanding that community means taking care of each other when things get hard. The Roberts ramp was both a physical structure that solved an immediate problem and a lasting symbol of what rural America was capable of when people chose action over resignation. 7 men, 7 specializations, 72 hours. One successful build that changed how emergency agricultural infrastructure would be approached across the entire country. That was the story of the Cross Brand Club and the Roberts Grain Elevator Ramp. That was the legacy they built together.